Good morning. Welcome to Modern Movement Symposium. I'm Greg Houston, President and CEO of International Arts and Artists. Let me start by thanking our partners. Today's symposium would not exist without the Art Museum of the Americas and the Organization of American States. Particular thank you goes to Adriano Spin and Ambassador Laura Heel for their collaboration in bringing the symposium and exhibition together. For more than 30 years, International Arts and Artists has worked to connect people across borders through art. And that is how we define cultural diplomacy. Not art as decoration, art as a way of understanding how different societies see themselves, see each other, and see the world. The exhibition currently on view at our Hilliard Galleries in downtown Washington, D.C., right between the Phillips and Cosmos, if you have not been, Modern Movements, Selections of Latin American and Caribbean Art from the Art Museum of the Americas, is a direct expression of that mission. This is work that crossed oceans and borders when it was made, carries ideas about modernity, identity from one hemisphere to the other, and the AMA is built on a shared conviction and one to the story of modern art, not peripheral to it. Zoom exists to make that argument in the most rigorous way possible. A reflection today span exhibition history, the Pan American Union, and the Cold War. And that range tells you something about how much there's still left to say. We have 3 great sessions ahead of us, each bringing new voices and new frameworks to the subject matter that deserves exactly this kind of attention. On behalf of INA, we are genuinely glad you are here, whether you're joining us from Washington or to kick work. Adriana, are you with us?
Good morning. Thank you very much, Greg. I was having some technical difficulties and it was difficult for me to hear your presentation, but thank you very much for the invitation to participate to this panel. The Art Museum of the Americas of the Organization of the American States. It's very pleased to be working with international arts and artists on this collaboration. This exhibition is part of a larger
trend. The wheel side. The sounds on the wheel.
Hello, can you hear me? Moving Movements is part of a larger exhibition that features the core of our permanent collection. And to begin the session today, I want to talk a little bit of the history of our institution. The Art Museum of the Americas, it's part of the Organization of the American States. And before there was the museum, which opened its doors in 1976, October 1976, 50 years ago. The Organization of the American States, known before as the Pan-American Union, had already established a pretty important art program in which its director, Jose Gomez traveled around the Americas looking for those artists that will become the major figures of what we now call modern art, modern Latin American art. So Jose Gomez began to work at the OAS in the mid-1940s. And in 1948, he had already established this art program. And it was a very disciplined art program in which he would have exhibitions at the OAS main building every month. And he traveled throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. And in 1948, he donated the very first piece of become our collection, and it's a piece that is now on view at the Hillier space, and it is returned from the fair from Brazilian artist Cândido Portinari. So that was the seminal piece that will found our collection. Then in 1957, the OEA's Permanent Council granted him a small acquisition fund, and he was very disciplined, and with those exhibitions that he was organizing at the OEA's main building, he was able to steadily collect pieces of what in those days were really young artists to become part of our collection. Then we also received several gift to the collection, for example, from the Rockefeller family, from the different countries of the Americas. We were talking about at the opening of the exhibition last week, how the Washington Workshop for the Arts donated a major mata in the 50s to the collection. And that's how our collection came about. They were having these artists such as Alejandro Obregón from Colombia, or well-known artist Fernando Otero of Colombia as well, were having their very first international exhibitions, or the very first exhibitions in the United States here at the headquarters of the Pan American Union. So in 1976, with the aim of having a space devoted to the permanent collection, it's when we open, when the OEAs opened the museum, those exhibitions that took place at the OEA's headquarters are now happening at the OEA's main build, at the museum main building. And we have today, our collection keeps growing, not as it used to grow before, but we keep promoting with our collection the core pillars of the Organization of the American States. So we are pretty much linked to that Greg Huston was mentioning earlier today when he mentioned art for diplomacy. And this is the core of the work that we do, and the core of the exhibition that we are presented at Hillier Space, and the main exhibition who will travel later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. We are thrilled to be partnering with you, AMA, and OAS to present this exhibition. As Greg mentioned, we encourage any of you that are in DC in April and May to come see the exhibition at our Hillier Gallery space. But this is actually part of a larger project that IANA is engaged with. It is 17 works from a broader 59 work traveling exhibition that we've recently launched to market and will begin touring in spring 2027. It is a really stunning show, as the Hillier selections is a great example. And I encourage, if you are associated with a museum or a university and would want to bring this exhibition to your own space, please reach out to us. We would love to collaborate with both our panelists and audience members further on helping to travel this exhibition and really kind of describe more in depth what it is that the AMA is doing and the OAS is doing, the work of cultural diplomacy, which we feel is now more important than ever. This is part of IANA's broader mission. Our traveling exhibition service has developed and circulated exhibitions designed for both small and large museums since 1995. We have coordinated more than 800 exhibition presentations at nearly 500 museums and cultural institutions all around the United States and internationally. AMA has been a long-time partner of IANA, and we're thrilled to be working with them again on this wonderful Modern Movements exhibition. If you are in Washington, D.C. and would like to learn more about the exhibition, Adriana and I will be in conversation on Thursday night talking about the works on display at Hillier. And I invite you to come and visit us and to meet us in person and introduce yourselves. But for now, we're really looking forward to hearing what our scholars have to say about this rich topic. We thank them for participating today and all of you for joining us remotely. I'd like to give a special shout out of praise to my colleague Rosa Jang, who has been really the engine behind putting together our symposium today. She has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this happen. She'll be our MC for the event today. So thank you very much, Rosa, for all of your hard work. And I turn over the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you, Greg and Adriana, for such warm welcomes. Welcome everyone to our Modern Movement Symposium. To kick off this morning's first session, I'm thrilled to introduce our first four speakers, Alejandro Soto Chavez, Ronan Shaw, Ginerva Bria, and Marco Polo Juarez Cruz. I will first introduce our speakers one by one, and after their introductions, they will present in succession. We ask that the audience members hold their questions until the end of the last presentation by Marco Polo, when we will open the floor to the Q&A. Our first session covers modernism and its discontents. Alejandro Soto Chavez is a doctoral student in modern languages at Merton College, University of Oxford, where his research examines Central American modernism, 1907 to 1971, in terms of the historical production of its cultural eligibility within Latin American and global modernist historiographies. He completed an international master's in managing art and cultural heritage in global markets from the University of Glasgow and holds a master's in art markets from the ISCTE University Institute of Lisbon, and a master's in arts and culture studies from Erasmus University Rotterdam. He previously also served as a lecturer in art history at Universidad de Costa Rica, and Soto Chavez has written widely on contemporary screen studies, avant-garde Costa Rican art, and contemporary Spanish cinema. Our second speaker, Ronan Shaw, is a second-year master's student at the University of Florida studying modern and contemporary Latin American and Caribbean art. His interests encompass socially engaged art and questions of gender, race, and sexuality as they relate to modernization, imperialism, and industrialization. His MA thesis explores the use of mass imagery in modern Mexican art from multiple perspectives, teasing apart the debates of nationalism versus vanguardism in discourses on Mexican modernity. He has completed internships with the Palmer Museum of Art, the Harn Museum of Art, the Barnes Foundation, and the University of Florida University Galleries. Shaw has previously presented papers on the arts of Brazil, Mexico, Cuba, the Harlem Renaissance, and China at multiple different venues. Our third speaker, Ginerva Bria, is a curator, researcher, and writer whose work bridges Italian modernism and the Brazilian avant-garde. For over a decade, she served as researcher and curator at the International Institute of Futurism Studies in Milan. Bria co-founded Future Dome in Milan in 2016, a platform for international contemporary art, and has contributed to major exhibitions at institutions including Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Grand Palais, ZKM, and the Venice Biennale. She has written for Flash Art, Moose Magazine, Domus, Aesthetica, and Vice, and has lectured at Bocconi University, Politecnico di Milan, and the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart. She is currently completing her PhD in art history at Rice University, and her doctoral work centers on the Brazilian sculptor Mary Vieira, with a particular focus on Vieira's procedural practice and her role as a cultural connector between Europe and Latin America. And last but not least, our final speaker for the morning session, Marco Polo Juarez Cruz, is Assistant Professor of Latin American Art History at California Polytechnic State University. His dissertation, Roots and Networks of Mexican Abstraction Across the Americas, 1958 to 1970, was recently completed at the University of Maryland, College Park, and it examines the circulation of ideas, materials, and aesthetic strategies among artists based in Mexico City, and their role in shaping Latin American modernism through abstraction, assemblage, performance, and other artistic practices in the 60s and 70s. He is interested in the emergence of abstraction and post-war avant-garde in the Americas and the relationship to national identities, artistic collectives, transnational cultural policies, and artistic agency in the so-called Global South. Born and raised in Mexico, Juarez Cruz has contributed to curatorial research projects at the Art Museum of the Americas in Washington, D.C., Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo, and Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas in Mexico City, and UMD Art Gallery. I'll turn it over to Alejandro. Sorry, give me 1 second.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I am honored to be part of this symposium and well, to start engaging in a more direct manner with such a crucial collection for my research. Thank you to international artists and artists, Gregory and Katie, and of course, Rosa, and to Adriana, and then Art Museum of the Americas for organizing this exhibition and this event. I'm sorry, Rosa, I just tell you next and we keep going that way, right? Just to confirm.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm gonna start. Well, I'm gonna present 3 theses on Central American modernist abstraction. I'm gonna explain why the modern is there. Next slide, please. In 1929, the Guatemalan writer and later Nobel Prize laureate Miguel Ángel Asturias wrote in his short story La Barba Provisional: Mi última noche de América la pasé corriendo por una selva oscura, toda acabada por el hueco de un corazón que en otros siglos llenó el mar. Iba detrás de un mono blanco, blanco como una estrella, como un serafín de la selva virgen, y no le pude alcanzar. En el viento, mojado de un gozo de presa que escapa, venía la sombra lenta del barco en que volví a París. Asturias constructed a sequence organized by pursuit and deferral. The figure in flight remains inaccessible. The landscape appears as a hollowed space structured by a preceding absence. The departing ship materializes as a temporal lag. Movement persists, resolution is withheld. This paper proposes that mid-20th century Central American modernist abstraction operated through a homologous structure, not a belated or derivative adoption of international trends, but as a practice constituted by displacement, partial articulation, and the deferral of definitive commitment. Abstraction here does not stabilize in a coherent program or group. It persists as a condition of search in which arrival is structurally foreclosed. Next slide, please. This logic extends beyond the literary image into the epistemic framing of Central America itself. The region has been persistently articulated through external designations, as you can read on the slide. That position Central America as a passageway, a constraint, a function, a channel. These terms operate as discursive frames that confine the region, limiting its legibility through catastrophe, volatility, and fundamentally, supposedly, force cultural dullness. The works of Carlos Mérida, Rodolfo Abularach, Alberto Dutari, Armando Morales, Mauricio Aguilar, and Lola Fernandez take shape within this circumstance. Their selection for this paper responds to the scope of the Art Museum of the Americas collection and does not seek to establish a canonical group. Their practices traverse pre-Columbian forms, surrealist devices, and mid-century abstraction languages, as we'll see in a minute. This paper approaches these practices through 3 interrelated theses or phases: surrealist-inflected abstraction, a hybrid pendulum, and an informalist turn, whose overlaps and interruptions articulate a particular modernist formation within Latin American art defined by transnational circulation. Next slide, please. Next. The first of these phases takes shape in the work of Carlos Mérida. From the mid-1930s, Mérida developed what he termed a synthesis americana, grounded in ethnological observations and a structure through a pars pro toto logic, in which fragments of Guatemalan and Mexican visual culture, such as Maya geometric patterning, popular textile ornamentation, ritual practices, and Tarascan sculpture vocabularies, stand in for a modern synthetic language. His written work advances a reformulation of the genealogy of abstraction from within a Latin American horizon, where rhythm, planar construction, and symbolic transposition organize the pictorial field. Next slide, please. This phase does not mark Mérida's first engagement with abstraction. Prior to his contact with surrealism, he had already implemented synthetic abstract languages through the conjunction of pre-Hispanic and popular forms with Cubism and Constructivism. His second stay in Paris in the late 1920s introduced a different inflection, opening a dialogue with non-figurative surrealism as developed by Joan Miró, Jan Arp, and Roberto Mata. Works such as Púrpura de Tormenta and Transparencia de la Memoria register this shift where biomorphic compositions emerge through a recasting of earlier visual systems. These works, however, do not signal a rupture. They recalibrate an already deep-seated abstract practice. Next. Thank you. Materiality becomes central at this juncture. In works such as Danza del Venado, Mérida foregrounds the medium as an active component of abstraction, incorporated amate with its irregular surface deliberately intruding on smooth pictorial surfaces, as you can see in these two examples. Next. This concern extends into later works where modularity, repetition, and spatial sequencing displace the pictorial field into rhythmic, almost architectural register. In this sense, his practice is on the threshold of a hybrid position already noted by Marta Traba, where indigenismo, surrealist techniques, and geometric abstraction coexist. Next. If Mérida established a constructive language through formal condensation, Abularach radicalized this maneuver by isolating the fragment. His early trajectory passes through figuration, and I always say that this central painting, that we have to remember that this is a painting by a 13-year-old, and then, of course, a cubist phase and bullfighting scenes before entering a stage closely aligned with Mérida's rhythmic patterning. Next. This foundation proves decisive when in 1958 he arrived in New York City to attend the Art Students League and encountered the milieu of the School of New York, where non-figurative surrealism, through newly arrived figures such as Roberto Mata, influenced and coexisted with abstract expressionism and the color field painters. Next. Works such as Fugitive from a Mayan Lintel, which is featured in Modern Movements, show this change. The sculptural fragment becomes both architecture and sign, dislocated and recomposed through a precise graphic syntax. Dense cross-hatching concurs with biomorphic forms derived from Maya iconography and surrealist automatism. Next. Through his altares and estandartes, as you can see in the slide, Abularach showcased the commitment to abstraction. Forms dissolve into attenuated contours, suspended within fields of modulated tonalities and muted chromatic transitions. The surface acquires a meditative stillness shaped by a confluence between Maya visual tropes and, in his own words, Zen philosophy. Next, please. This phase does not align with the gestural urge of abstract expressionism. It unwraps through restraint and calibrated variation, even in scale, as you can see. The resulting language remains a cosmological orientation while engaging the spatial and chromatic concerns of color field painting. In this sense, Abularach extends Mérida's problem into a different register, where abstraction becomes a site of spiritual resonance and suspension in a Pyrrhonic sense, epoché, or epoché as we say in Spanish. Next, please. The period is fleeting. He never returned to it. His now legendary encounter with the eye in the mid-1960s, already suggested through round forms in his color field altarpieces, reorientates without fully exhausting the trajectory of his later work. Next. We're going to go through the second phase or thesis. Yes, next. With Armando Morales, the query of abstraction enters a different breadth. His work marks the second thesis of this paper, where abstraction and figuration unfold through sustained oscillation. Trained under Rodrigo Peñalba, Morales developed early on a vocabulary already permeated by surrealist sympathies. Works such as Spook Tree and La Perra Pariendo signal this condition where tropical imagery is filtered through distortion, stylization, and oniric tension in certain proximity to Wilfredo Lam. This early semi-abstraction cohabits with an increasing attention to gesture and material density. Next. His move to New York in 1960 introduced a decisive transformation, extending beyond style and into scale. Works such as Guerrillero Muerto, Ocho deploy large planes of muted color and varied textures, where political violence is evoked through the intercalation of matter. Forms appear as physical metallic fragments within a controlled field, recalling informalist procedures. Next. This strategy developed further in the mid-1960s, where flatness, non-gestural chromatic modulation, and, to paraphrase Greenberg, a tendency to openness and clarity, situate his work, well, as you can see in these three examples, in proximity to color-filled painting and the subsequent tradition. Next. This position, of course, remains unstable. By the second half of the decade, Morales slowly returned to figuration, feminine bodies, landscape, fruits, architectural spaces, reintroduced through a visual syntax that transforms memory, his native Granada, into image. His practice advanced as a pendular movement where abstraction persists as a provisional and rescindable condition. Next. This oscillatory state finds a parallel development in the work of Panamanian painter Alberto Dutari. His work appears within the broader emergence of Nueva Figuración across the Americas from the 1950s onward, drawing on Spanish informalism, particularly the material and gestural intensity of El Paso after his training in Madrid, as well as Tachism, the rawness of Dubuffet, and the force of the De Kooning Woman series. In early paintings such as Bodegón con Pez, the figure persists while undergoing unremitting deformation. Next. Whereas in works such as Pareja, figuration remains legible, organized through a tense relational structure. In La Playa, this relation begins to dissolve as the figure disperses into a more diffuse and textural surface, where the environment absorbs bodily presence. Next. In Personajes al Crepúsculo, the one on the right, exhibited at the OAS in 1961, the human body emerges through layers of paint, collage, and abrasive materials, producing a surface where figuration and matter interpenetrate. The figures with enlarged heads and amorphous limbs almost glide with trembling volatility while embedded in a bleak post-atomic horizon. This pictorial field does not resolve into abstraction, it thickens around the figure, absorbing it into a textural landscape. His so-called saints' grotesque, wounded bodies stage a fragile persistence of the human within a shattered world. Abstraction here remains present as a pressure within the image. Next. This swinging reaches a different variation in the work of Mauricio Aguilar, where the pendular movement contracts. Tragically understudied, this Salvadoran painter was trained in Paris at the Académie Julian and marked by the legacy of Morandi Pittura Metafísica. Aguilar developed a pictorial language defined by control, shine, and material overload. In works such as Glasses in Green, forms are reduced to minimal configurations, bottles, vessels, fragments, distributed across the texture area in which contours soften into an almost atmospheric surface. The object persists as a distant reference, suspended within a monochromatic space. Next. Aguilar's surfaces built through subtle tonal variations, foreground materiality as a site of perception. His well-known idea fix in bottles and still life motifs translate into a rumination of stillness, seclusion, and spatial ambiguity. Between Divencorn's still life approach and Ryman's monochromes, Aguilar's time in New York took a toll on his work. Next. From this point, the pendular movement reaches a limit. In the works that follow, material saturation and surface take precedence, opening onto an informalist approach in which an abstraction unfolds through the density of matter itself. Next. Next. In the work of Lola Fernandez, the pendular movement gives way to her last thesis, an informalist leap, in which color, matter, and gesture become the primary conduits of pictorial expression. In early works, Fernandez moved from academic figuration toward increasingly unstable compositions. After her training in Italy and her study trips to Morocco, the Middle East, and India, in paintings such as La Violencia, as you can see on the right, the surface begins to clot and the image drips and fractures under the pressure of tonal density. Next. Thank you. The exploration intensified in the 1960s in works such as Impresión en Rojo or Return of the Ancestor, which is also featured in modern movements. Color and texture operates with greater autonomy. Layers of pigment, stain, and tonal variation produce a dense surface organized through a surplus without any recourse to figuration. Next. Subsequent works extend this logic through collage, imprint, and relief, where surface and volume begin to intersect. This condition resonates with Marta Trava's characterization of her work as a mosaic-like construction, an inverted tapestry, if you will, in which the similar elements coexist within a disjointed grid. Next. And well, here is the slide. In this slide, here's the relief I mentioned, and a picture with Orfila and Gomez Sicre at one of her multiple exhibitions at the Pan American Union. Next. Well, now to finalize perhaps the next one, which is the last. In some Central American modernist abstraction, to remain faithful to Merida's genealogy, emerged as a collection of visual languages structured through circulation, networks, and diaspora. The three moments or theses examined here reveal a practice defined by instability. None of the artists maintain a fixed allegiance to abstraction. The absence of a pure abstract painter is symptomatic in the best sense of a broader condition. These circumstances shape the debates on intentionality and mimicry in the region, particularly in the aftermath of the 1971 Central American Biennale, a liminal traumatic event that crystallized the transition between modernism and contemporary art in the region, while calling for a more situated vernacular languages. Central American modernism thus played out as a transnational formation, a Latin American node whose apparent disintegration enabled a distinctive non-institutional mode of cultural production. That is to say, it was what Asturias had already imagined as a pursuit without a rival. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alejandro. Next up, sorry. Okay, we'll have Ronan presenting.
Morning, can everyone hear me okay? Good, thank you. I'd like to just start by taking a moment to thank International Arts and Artists and the Art Museum of the Americas for helping to organize this panel, for inviting me, and for convening all of us together to advance dialogues on Latin American modernism. And I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, and I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for taking the time out of their busy schedules to come together with us to advance this conversation. You can advance. Mask 1 by Germán Cueto is well known and has appeared in multiple exhibitions of Mexican modernism, but its innovative and dynamic formal elements deserve further scholarly attention. Patterns of black, white, blue, green, and pink are painted on cardboard and spiral around a mouth lined with crooked teeth. Facial features collide, melt, slide across the surface, and cut through space to confront the viewer and push the boundaries of facial legibility. The face of the mask becomes almost unrecognizable. The only features that stick out are the open mouth and an eye in the center that glares at the viewer. The distorted face appears to scream, conjuring a feeling of pain and doubt, but also it implies change and renewal. Advance. Another mask from the same year, 1924, Mask 3, takes a different form but engages with similar formal ideas. Abstract designs guide the viewer's eye up across the figure towards a curving form that resembles the hat of a clown or a jester. Here, a face is barely discernible at all. The mask does not even have eye holes for the wearer of the mask to see through. Events. Finally, in 1927, mask number 551 exchanges cardboard for copper in its material construction. The jump from the biomorphic material of cardboard to a cold industrial metal imprints a different feeling onto the artwork, whereas masks 1 and 3 have a lightness and a steadfastness and a pictorial vibrancy. Mask 551 is dense, heavy, and impersonal. It recalls a more dangerous environment, such as a factory or a construction site, rather than the folkloric colors and vibrancy of masks 1 and 3. Advance. Germán Cuetos' masks show the key features of the aesthetics of stridentism, one of Mexico's most important avant-garde movements in the early 20th century, which was founded in 1921 and ended in 1927 as a cohesive group. Some key features that the stridentists valued were a bombastic abstraction and attention to the modern feel of the new city. Though visually distinct, Germán Cuetos' masks all engage with the materiality of modernity in various ways in line with the broader aesthetic stridentist movement. Masks 1 and Mask 3 both rely on the construction out of inexpensive material of cardboard, a modern material, while Mask 551 references metal, which is commonly found in urban environments. Stridentism praised dynamism, absurdity, and modernity, combining elements of European Dada, simultaneism, Spanish ultraism, and Italian futurism, often in contradictory ways to adapt itself to the Mexican context. Advance. The members of this group, the Stridentists, largely utilized pictorial abstraction in combination with depictions of modernity and the modern city, such as power lines and factories in this slide. Cuetos' masks make their own interesting argument on the increasing presence of technology in our everyday lives, to the point in which the body begins to resemble machines in his works. This is where the form of the mask becomes charged, as Cueto crafted this mask as a singular object by hand out of cardboard and metal, whereas masks in general at this time in Mexico shifted from being individual objects to be increasingly consumed as mass-produced commodities. Here, in this juxtaposition of the machine-like and the handmade, audiences witness what Tatiana Flores calls a central theme of stridentism, the oscillation between aldo-primitivism and strategies of urban modernity. Advance. Cueto, as a sculptor, has been subject to numerous analyses and scholarly treatments by scholars in Mexico, France, Spain, and the United States. Tatiana Flores and Linda Klitsch both analyzed Cueto's mask-making practice in the context of Mexican discourses on race and identity, and they both tie the mask to Cueto's contacts and inspiration from European art. However, their arguments are different in their focus. Whereas Flores cites the masks as articulations primarily of a homegrown vanguardist identity that was responding to new ideas of Mexican identity during and after the Mexican Revolution, Linda Klitsch focuses on how masks are symbols of cultural renewal and innovation in a broader context, problematizing them in relation to their transatlantic inspiration, and she ties them to a wider moment of cultural discontent. While their analyses broadly overlap, they differ in their motivations for considering the mask alongside other avant-garde developments. The French scholar Serge Fachereau, who wrote for the catalog of a Cueto retrospective at the Museo Reina Sofia, comments on the masks primarily as symbols of transculturation, and subsequent museum commentary, such as from Enrique Ramirez at the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Luis Potosí, focused primarily on the mask's materiality as being made from discarded materials as emblematic of their modernity and connection to modern city life. Advance. Adding to this discourse, I argue that Germán Cueto's masks are a point of departure from the broader ideological trends of stridentism. In fact, they expose some of its more dogmatic elements and internal contradictions. In my talk, I will problematize his masks in relation to stridentism's inconsistent embrace of class-based social analysis, which views the city simultaneously as a site of innovation and exploitation. The founder of The founder of stridentism, Manuel Maples Arce, praise the city as a dynamic space, but Cuetos' masks and work in general reflect the more harsh and impersonal aspects of urban living by mapping the alienation of modern life onto the form of the mask via pictorial abstraction and formal distortion. I follow two aesthetic threads, the mask form itself and the use of abstraction, to analyze how Cuetos' masks are at once reactions to the commercialization of folk art and the alienation of the modern city. By highlighting Cuetos' own words and Stridentism's Marxist influences, I argue that the masks show a new side, a new face, perhaps, of modernity that the Stridentists could not originally account for. Its ability to embroil unsuspecting publics into tendencies of capitalism and ideological fervor. Due to time constraints, I will only be focusing on three masks that predate his 1927 move to Paris to focus more on the Mexican discourses about the works. But if anyone is curious, I welcome inquiry in the Q&A. They're very interesting. They were made after he encountered Joaquin Torres Garcia. You can advance. To start, the form of the mask itself. The mask in modern Mexican culture was an ambivalent symbol following the Mexican Revolution. Masks have been very ubiquitous symbols in folk culture for generations. And following the Mexican Revolution, state apparatuses, such as the Ministry of Public Education, headed by Jose Vasconcelos, encouraged the promotion of folk art, which they now renamed Arte Popular to tie it to a mass politic. For example, the exhibition of popular arts in 1921 in Mexico City presented indigenous folk art to urban publics for the first time. They primarily included textiles, but they also included a number of masks. Intellectuals, who were also hired by the government, promoted indigenous art as an alternative to European arts, which previous generations of Mexicans and artists drew inspiration from in the formation of their aesthetic identities. Initiatives of state and nation building following the Mexican Revolution caused such folk masks to be associated with Mexico as a whole, and artists began incorporating arte popular and masks into their artworks, but such artworks fundamentally decontextualize this art in a specific way. Advance. As masks and arte popular were incorporated into modernist aesthetic discourse, these masks achieved a new meaning that was added to over time. The Stridentists were invested in such discourses, and there's numerous evidence that they made trips to the areas around Mexico City that were not as built up, such as Xochimilco, to engage with and consume arte popular. In this sense, Germán Cuetos' masks participate in this discourse of referencing the fetishization of folk art by the post-revolutionary state and wider Mexican society. However, the way he imbues them with an alienating abstraction makes his intervention stand out. And I will further articulate how the environment of the modern city further adds to the feeling of his works. Advance. In their writings, the Stridentist city is imagined as a utopian space, specifically in the poetry and manifestos of Stridentism's founder, Manuel Maples Arce. In the visual arts, the city appears more foreboding and intimidating, however. An aesthetic of verticality and conformity alienates the viewer, while a lack of life and organic space prevents the viewer from further comfort and immersion into the city as a natural space. Despite human figures not being present in the Stridentist cityscape, Germán gestures to the masses and to people through the inclusion of the mask form itself. As devices of both identity creation and obscuration, masks are symbols that, when adopted, can help to create anonymity and create a fluidity of movements. Once worn, the masks allow the wearer to move about the city without the pressures to conform to any one role. This allows for the subversion of societal norms in a way that challenges the balance of power. Yet the act of disguising oneself fundamentally erases oneself at the same time. As Linda Klitsch notes, Germán's mask-making practice allows for the concretizing of a vanguard identity, which blurs the lines between the personal and the public, the spectating and the spectator. Advance. I argue that Cueto engages with this wider dialogue by combining the folkloric form of the mask with geometric abstraction to show the contradictions of the modern city. But in this context, Cueto's masks act as extensions of Stridentism's reading of Marxism, particularly in their attention to the facet of alienation in both a public space and a capitalist environment. In the masks, the wearer becomes one with the abstraction of the city itself and the abstraction of capitalist society. The contorted expression Cueto imbues in his masks implies some sort of pain or isolation. By existing in an urban capitalist space, the masses are transformed physically and psychologically, with the effects often leaving faces barely recognizable and disconnected from a legible referent. Cueto's masks also show the changing relationship between Stridentism and the Mexican city. When Arce first published his manifesto in 1921, which I pictured here on the right, and his later poem Urbe in 1923, the optimism of the Mexican Revolution was still fresh. Public artworks were being commissioned by the government to beautify public spaces and educate the masses. Arce himself responded positively to this development. He was a fan and occasional friend of Diego Rivera, and he construed the city, the Mexican city, Mexico City specifically, as a well-constructed machine, with technology acting as a broader structure, and workers acted as the cogs that made that machine function. Yet the reality was actually quite different. The city was increasingly a site of exploitation and violence and increased sexuality, a view that is reflected in visual depictions of the city, as well as in Cueto's masks. Scholars have alluded to Stridentism's engagement with new forms of popular culture that were increasingly present in cities, such as advertising and ephemera. Advance. In his writings and in his newspapers and journals, Arce included a number of visual catalogs, especially in Actual Número Uno, which was Stridentism's newspaper. He argued that advertising visuals represented a key way that consumption was integrated into everyday experiences, and he was referencing new ways of mass communication. I argue that Cueto also engages with this idea, but in a more ambivalent way. In a mask owned by the Museum of Modern Art from 1924, which I've pictured here on the right, the turquoise one, Cueto combines the aesthetics of craft and mass media to create a new hybrid form that is neither but both at the same time. He combines simple, bold patterns, bright, garish colors, and an angular physicality. In the Blaisden Collection's Mask 1, which is on the left, artificial colors combine with geometric shapes across the primitivizing form of the mask, paradoxically made modern through visual abstract strategies. The black and white grid, on the right side of the face echoes the blocky text of a newspaper or the black and white of a film or photograph. The dull green grays throughout recall rusting metal, bent and reshaped to form cars, girders, and other machinery that pollutes and enlivens the urban space. Pinks, blues, and purples conjure images of new clothes, cosmetics, signs, and window displays that commercialize and even sexualize the built environment. The rhomboid and triangular shapes are inherently dynamic, and such forms were even used in the design of cars and airplanes for their aerodynamic qualities. Advance. Unlike Arce's manifesto, the mask is not optimistic about modernity or industrialization. In his masks, we see subtle ruptures in Cueto and Arce's respective philosophies. Where Arce reflects the positivist zeitgeist of the early 1920s, Cueto's masks reveal the twisted, vulgar realities of the Mexican city itself. And here, just as a comparison, I include a photograph by Katsi Horna, Las Castañedas, which translates to those who have been forgotten or cast aside. And she was a close personal friend of Germán Cueto. Earlier on in the presentation, in the photo of him, she took that photo. And so I bring her because she is an artist who is very concerned about bringing the struggles of the marginalized very explicitly, as you can see in this photo that she took in the 1940s in a mental asylum. She was from Hungary, and she was very committed to the struggles of the marginalized within Mexican cities and Mexican society in general. But the way she did so can be problematized. Germán himself implies this rupture, the rupture of the Stridentist utopian view of the city and the actual existence of the city. He implies this rupture when he spoke about his work itself. He said, sculpture, like any work of art, must first be an authentic creation, and second, it must honor the expression of some thought or feeling, and third, it must be free of all mercantile stimuli. In that third part, he specifically mentions the market. Unlike Arce, who thought of art as a vehicle for vanguard change and innovation, Cueto believed in a more traditional view of art as a means of personal expression and emancipation. He used his masks to show his own experience of the city rather than try to homogenize experiences of the city in a utopian lens. He used his masks to question Arce's polemical views, I argue, of the city as a space of potential, illustrating through abstraction and alienation the ways in which the city affected individual bodies and psyches. The masks further point to subtle ruptures in Stridentism's internal philosophy and contradictions, prefiguring its cataclysmic downfall in the late 1920s. In 1927, the Stridentists moved to Jalapa, which is in Veracruz, and they were involved in socialist politics there. But when the socialist governor was ousted from office, many of the Stridentists moved to Paris, including Germán and his wife Lila Cueto. And once they arrive in Paris, their work takes on a different flavor based on their contacts with other Latin American artists in Paris, which is narrated by scholars such as Michel Griet. Advance. In this presentation, I showed and argued the complex visual discourses that Germán Cueto participated in as a member of the Tridentist movement, which took inspiration from multiple transatlantic sources. I argue that Cuetos masks are not only emblematic of this cultural exchange, but also point to Cuetos' own disagreements with Arce's utopian views of the city, and show the ways Cueto believed the modern city affected the human mind and psyche. Through his geometric abstraction and appropriation of the folkloric mask form, Cueto shows a new form of cultural expression that challenges the line between fine and folk, urban and rural, and personal and collective. The mask is a symbol that can be worn, but it also obscures identity and abstracts it. But wearing this mask perhaps is the only way to survive in the modern city. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronan. And our third speaker, oops, sorry. Will be Ginerva.
Are all able to listen to me well? Rose, is it appropriate, the volume of my conversation? Or is it too loud for everyone?
I can hear you. It's perfect.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks again. So I owe my gratefulness to the International Arts and Artists and Art Museum of the Americas Modernist Movement Symposium for this very compelling and I may say in-depth invitation I received. Please advance. Set in an utterly empty 200 square meter room, Cruzeiro do Sul measures only 9 millimeters on a side. First conceived for MoMA in 1970, it consists of 2 blocks of wood, 2 different Amazonas timbers, more correctly, joined to shape a mini-cube. According to the Brazilian artist Cildo Meireles, born in 1948 in Rio de Janeiro, the 2 different types of wood enclose an atom of the Tupi-Guarani people's cosmogony. Within the indigenous ontology, the rubbing together of these 2 tiny logs would manifest the divinity of fire. This atom constitutes an impotential spark, embedded to inform a primordial nature of the human power on earth, an invisible ember counterweighting the primitivist trope of cannibalism in Brazilian modernism. By exhibiting this work in a New York museum during the most repressive period of the Brazilian military dictatorship of Vargas, the artist characterized and deflected the scholarly tendency to see the occult and the irrational as the repressed and paradoxical underbellies of the rationalist program of modernity. Please advance, Rosa. The paper, titled Against Modernist Primitivism, Cildo's Meireles Cruzeiro do Sul, 1969-70, and The Savage Slot, grafts an unpublished interview with Cildo Meireles focused on the Brazilian artist's pivotal work, Cruzeiro do Sul. It interprets the artwork through the lens of the savage sloth, a stark metaphor proposed by the Haitian-American anthropology, Michel Trouillot, 1949-2012. For Trouillot, utopian spaces in the West are interstices of wideness and power, hidden in plain sight, within latent post-colonial context of marginalized native peoples. Wideness as a Western utopia project was constructed as a direct consequence of the thingification and bestialization of colonial territories on their population, creating sloths among forms of humanity. There are interstices between how to make men out of the other and how to take all men as a subject. The savage sloth is a symbolic field of significance that anthropology fulfills within the trilogy Order, Utopia, Savagery, a triad that constituted the West as we know it, a complementary project of the otherness constructed during the Renaissance. Please advance, Rose. How art, like anthropology, may interrogate and visualize through your notion of the savage sloth? And when did it become manifest in a country such as Brazil, a country considered, I'm quoting, the first modern society formed in the tropics with national characteristics and enduring qualities? I end up the quotes, and how adopting this vantage point may dissect the monumentalism of the West and its demands of an elsewhere. Drawing on the concept of the savage lot and through unedited words of Meireles, my paper traces the utopian trajectories in which whiteness continued to have currency in a nominally native post-colonial nation, unmasking a discourse on race that is articulated through global economics, political practices, and cultural hierarchies, reinforcing the white privilege at a local level and drawing a vector from modernism to developmentalism. Please advance, Rose. Meireles' artwork is hereby demarcating the enunciative, physical, linguistic, and symbolic space of the savage through an account of an ideal state, the prototypical nowhere of European into the broader utopian terrain that makes the savage slot possible and that preserves the special position of the slot, even in its inner context change. Trouillot addresses the metaphorical slot gap through its postmodern tropes of the non-white and colonial other, mirroring how in Cruzeiro do Sul, the West establishes itself as a utopian project against the savage and means for itself, the West, to be the condition of a new visual ontology of the savage. This osmotic symmetry between Trouillot and Meireles' anthropological approaches arises symbiotically, remarking that after hundreds of years of colonialism, I'm quoting Trouillot, the savage become absence and negation. And nevertheless, discourses about the savage within Cruzeiro do Sul are always still caught up in arguments for or against utopia and for or against certain forms of political order. Here you could see in this slide a very, very schematic way of just framing the discourse on this specific Tupi-Guarani tribe that Cildo Meireles condensated in Cruzeiro do Sul. Please, Rose, advance. This paper formulated on the savage slot, conceptual triad of order, utopia, savage, and Meireles' words is divided into three sections. The order, information at MoMA in 1970, the utopia, Cruzeiro do Sul, and the space. The utopia second part, Cruzeiro do Sul, and the time. And eventually the last part, the last chapter or sub-chapter is the savage, between tropos and utopos. Please, Rose, advance. The utopic notion of unlimited communication and historical present, often referred in a contemporary rhetoric as the new frontier of the late capitalism, envisions the world as a global system in which the media enables the flow of information and capital to break free from national boundaries. And as Meireles affirmed, esse, Cruzeiro do Sul, foi sempre trabalho feito para falar do entorno. This was always a word made to talk about the surroundings. I just would like to remind here that Cruzeiro do Sul, 9 millimeters for 9 millimeters, was exhibiting 200 square meters of emptiness at MoMA in 1970. Thus at MoMA in the early 70s, aesthetic participation had to be reimagined as the viewer was both compelled to move beyond its spectatorial neutrality and made consciously aware of the limits of a participatory gesture. Indeed, the artwork was specifically conceived as a pace setter into a watershed show that unveiled the museum as a contested space and the artwork as a, I'm quoting Meireles, un punto limite in un mondo ambiente, a limit point in a new dimension work, if I may say. In that agora, the curator offered the first record of the growing historical awareness of the informationalization of contemporary society, inviting more than 100 artists to contribute. The curator foresaw the vanishing point of the paradigm shift from the industrial age to the information society, not in the electronic revolution per se, but rather in a new sense of the fruition of time. Here I'm quoting Kynaston McShine, the curator, and fast transmission in conjunction with the strong impact of visual imagery circulation in the newspapers or periodicals, on television, or in the cinema. I would like to remember that in this exhibition there were present from Andy Warhol to Elliot Usica as well. Please, Rosa, the next one. McShine ensures art and artists' public recognition by an emerging information society. I'm quoting him. The art cannot afford to be provincial or to exist only within its own history. If you are an artist in Brazil, you know at least one friend who is being tortured. If you are one in Argentina, you probably have had a neighbor who had been in jail for having long hair or for not being dressed properly. It may seem too inappropriate, if not absurd, to get up in the morning, walk into a room, and apply dabs of paint from a little tube to a square canvas. What can you, as a young artist, do that seems relevant and meaningful during these times? How, in this context of proximity with the contingencies of the West, may an artist write the history of his present while also avoiding the savage slot? And where, considering the general social, political, and economic crisis that started to become universal phenomenon of 1970, was the history of the impossible, to quote Trujillo, happening or was about to happen? Why did Cruzeiro do Sul, within the context of the information exhibition, constitute the symbolic across the problems of order, utopia, and savagery? And where do the people without history, as they call the savage, and they define the savage people in Brazil, breach the bonds of such a trilogy, underlining a relation of power? Please, Rose, the next one. At MoMA in 1970, information was driven by a need to communicate and to improve the world, following some local and not merely historical interpretation of it. Utopias remained a goal, and artists resisted the obstacle that stood in the way of achieving them. The most moderate manifestation of this way was the effort to get rid of the stumbling block posed by the commercial object that art always seems destined to become. Thus, the exhibition's intent was to make art that bypassed the limit state of objective and objectual information to become an historical living present, a living utopia, a meditation on order, and a different kind of territorial reality, much more anecdotal and anthropological, took hold. Coincidentally, this also satisfied the external demands of folkloric looks that fit the new trend of hegemonic multiculturalism. Thus, something like Latin American conceptualism, which looked more global but was really more local, ended up being, if not lost, at least eroded. Please, the next one. Cruzeiro do Sul indeed proposes a large, almost deserted gap charged by a single focal point on object whose isolation is not exacerbated, so expanded that it solidifies as a possession of forces. As is typical for Meireles' work, this project assumes the situation of an exhibition as its territorial condition. Cruzeiro do Sul, immersed in its constitutive and generative fieldwork, the required 200 square meters, turns into the assumption that Meireles' savage slot is about the presence and affirmation of the savage. The artwork becomes a center, a posit, and begin an outside, whereas its alterity ignites a primary standpoint to overturn the dominant culture. The standpoint of the beholder is adjustment for a correct participation observation, a contact distance, and an interpretative approach retain the notion of persons as approaching subjects, converging subjects towards an object that determines the proportions of the surroundings and that defines their position in terms of truth, eventually locating that truth in terms of alterity. Please, the next one, Rose. The plight of native people was a cause close to Meireles' family. His father, a government official in the state of Goiás, in the north of Brazil, worked for the Indigenous Protection Service and was involved with the indigenous rights movement. By exposing a government scandal involving a genocide, Meireles became one of the first people in Brazil to bring the murders of a tribe of Tupi to court. During the 40s and the 50s, the artist uncle Chico Meireles was one of the first to try to save the indigenous from inevitable extinction by helping them to gain control of their lands. His uncle's son, Apoena Meireles, also worked with Indians in the fight to demarcate their lands in the early 60s. Their leftist idea and the social concerns would have a strong impact on Meireles' approach to the arts, especially because he started to work on these fields while he was very young, at the age of 18. Meireles' approach to the arts, especially his focus on minority, is long negated by Brazilian society. Meireles addressed the colonization of the Indians by missionary Jesuits and their misunderstanding of native cults and mythology only in these early works. Please see in this slide, Desvio para o Vermelho, 1968-1984, as in fact Cruzeiro do Sul. The sculpture, once displayed in an exhibition space, became a territorial entity, almost imperceptible and at the same time defined by its materiality, visible only from an aerial view, like a punctual plano pilota. In this view, the oak and the pine are more than mere natural elements for the Tupi natives. They believe these timbers have no human but divine power, and that the friction created by rubbing one against the other would have created fire, a sacred manifestation of their deities on earth as inner agents of their landscape. The miniaturized artwork, Cruzeiro do Sul, contains potentially igniting, kindling energy, a metonymy of supernatural and causal sparks, an idea that would later be taken to extremities by Meireles in some of his most emblematic works against the military regime. Please, Rose, the next one. Cruzeiro do Sul, at the moment, dismantled through its wordless information the semantics between abstract, racial formulation and actual history of racial discrimination and subjugation. A wooden microsculpture from his manifesto stated, I'm quoting the manifesto, from a region which does not appear on official maps, delineated a territory where, I'm quoting again, metaphors have no intrinsic values. Then Meireles recently added, whenever listening to the history of this West, people will be listening to fantastic legends and fables and allegories for a people who can transform their history into fantastic legends, fables, and allegories that people have a real existence. The West, indeed, was always first as utopia or as a challenge to it, that he is a universalist project, the boundaries of which were non-civilized and non-spatial, who, topos, and where, to quote Utopias by Thomas More, where whoever does not have an urn has the sky to cover him. And as information showed, as you may see in this picture as well, the utopian West was forced also in the construction of complementarities. The visual utopianism that materializes the conformation of Cruzeiro do Sul constitutively depends on a previous production of the void into which an inscription that paraded as foundational could be performed. Please, Rosa, the next one. Meireles, constructing a fieldwork through Cruzeiro do Sul at MoMA, unhinged the contradictory method of structuralist anthropology, denouncing how race is defined insofar as the savage and is meant to reveal universal, archetypal tendencies implicated in a hierarchy of racial difference as human scales. A racialized notion of the savage slot does not always strictly correspond to ethnic categories of humans, as the Tupi tribes. Instead, it supersedes race as such, as it describes different categories of thought and subjectivity related to the territorial affirmations, question of self-determination, capacity of contestation, and political agency, as the artist stated just 1 year ago. The divine spark, in fact, resisting the ordinary notions of visibility, as the milieu of information suggests, function as an imperceptible incubator of valences, which were deeply connected, if not casually, then at the level of ordering utopias. Just as the word information evokes, the sculpture was saturated with meaning from several directions and was also being interrogated by multiple questions. For Meireles, represented by Cruzeiro do Sul in an international exhibition at just 26 years old, the field of the savage slot, grafted into the Western thought, lived, wrestled with, and thrived off of the very same baseline claim that only beyond the sign system lie the individual and the political comprehensive as such, and that more profoundly still, the word itself could not be indeed what was not without the colonizing sign of the Cruz. Thanks so much.
And our final speaker for the first session will be Marco Polo.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Thank you to you, to Adri, and all the staff of the Art Museum of the Americas, on all the organizers for bringing us together this morning. My paper may appear to focus on a familiar concept and a mere translation, but its origins are rooted in broader conversations with colleagues across the hemisphere, along with my own scholarship on modernisms in the Global South and the hierarchical categorizations of non-Western art that still affect our interpretations of creativity, influence, and schools emerging beyond artistic hegemonic centers. I am part of a research project coordinated by Jorge Lopera and Rita Eder that aim to analyze how art criticism in the Americas emerged as a source to produce theories and conceptual approaches to artistic practices. From our seminar's dictionary of terms to be published in the near future, the concept of arte latinoamericano emerged as a critical category in constant revision, associated with the demand of a visual language independent of European and USA models, as it was proposed by scholars like José Carlos Mariátegui, Marta Traba, and Fernando Ortiz. A review of historical sources reveals also that the English language concept of Latin American art has often obeyed political strategies and curatorial discourses. While it helped position hemispheric artists within a framework of global modernity, often it may serve to imperialist and neocolonialist agendas that relegated these artists to a subordinate place within the Western canon. Next, please. The regionalization of arte latinoamericano has provoked divergent responses to its creators, responding historically to markets, cultural circuits, and new perspectives to the art of the so-called Global South. In 1988, John Joe famously criticized MoMA's relegation of Wilfredo Lamb's The Jungle to a marginal hallway near the courtroom. Decades later, Land's 2025 exhibition When I Don't Sleep, I Dream was celebrated as his first retrospective in the United States. Even then, the emphasis on "in the United States" seemed to erase the relevance of prior scholarship and exhibitions until his work was validated by a flagship institution. Next, please. A similar pattern appears in Rita Eder's recollection of interviewing Gyula Kosice and encountering his work stored in a Buenos Aires unit, long before the cultural establishment embraced his unconventional frames and kinetic installations as part of the genealogy of abstraction in Latin America. Next, please. Throughout the 20th century, the categorization of Latin American art was closely tied to curatorial initiatives led by institutions such as the Center for Inter-American Relations and the Organization of American States. Figures including José Gómez Sicre, Alfred Barr, and Thomas Messer emphasized local accents, creative plurality, and artistic freedom over overt political dogma. This approach enabled the construction of collections in which artists from the region appeared to dialogue with international contemporaries through shared modernist languages. Conversely, critics such as Marta Traba and Roberto Pontual sought to define hemispheric practices through the singularities of individual artists, framing their development through external dialogue while resisting homogenization. Next, please. Confronted in distinct stages, artists experience a different assessment when positioning their artworks in the distinct umbrellas. In 1964, Rogelio Polisello presented Faz A in the Argentinian ESO Salon, a transnational effort organized in 13 different Latin American nations by the Organization of American States with the financial support of Standard Oil Company and its subsidiaries. The exhibition selected 2 painters and 2 sculptors from each country to present their work at OAS headquarters in Washington, D.C. in an hemispheric showcase, in an hemispheric salon showcasing the cutting edge of Latin American arts. In his efforts to align Latin American arts with Western practices, Gomez-Sicre invited prominent figures from USA museums to jury the exhibition. Alfred Barr, director of museum collections and former director of MoMA, Gustav von Greuschwitz, director of the Carnegie Museum of Art, and Thomas Messer, director of the Guggenheim. Despite their significance in the USA art scene, these jurors had limited connections with Latin American artists, having organized only sporadic exhibitions between 1950 and 1965. Gomez-Sicre's choice to involve these cultural powerhouses reflected his aim to evaluate Latin American modernism through USA standards familiar to Messer, Barr, and Greuschwitz. Ultimately, the jury awarded the first prize to Faz a painting that had previously received only an honorable mention in the Argentinian Salon, behind Victor Chap's and Ernesto Deira's abstract works. Faz A appealed to the USA jurors with its expressionist brushstrokes layered beneath stencil patterns of orange, purple, and yellow. Polisello used physical barriers like masking tape and metallic plates with round holes to spray paint over brown and black tones, creating colorful geometric patterns that form an optical illusion of transparency. The jurors saw this as a Polisello's dialogue with the USA artists like Jasper Jones and Robert Rauschenberg, reflecting the industrial automation of the artistic processes and the dilution of the artist's presence on the canvas. Next, please. The categorization of artistic practices as Latin American becomes increasingly complex when artists occupy liminal spaces shaped by migration, mixed heritages, and diaspora. After living in Argentina and Japan, Kazuya Sakai arrived in Mexico City with a body of work that fused references to his Argentinian and Japanese backgrounds and dialogues with USA popular culture and jazz. Works titled James Bond and Ornette Coleman in Village Vanguard exemplify this synthesis. Gone merges avant-garde elements such as stencil words, transfer imagery, and spray gun paint with layered color bands and geometric shapes rooted in earlier series and traditional Japanese illustration. In the 1980s, Sakai's Genroku series consolidated early phases of his practice, bridging an informalist period developed in Argentina as part of the Grupo de los Cinco with the circular color bands of the 1970s that reference jazz structures. Next, please. Through hard-edged color bands and precisely delineated geometric forms, Sakai paid homage to Japanese tradition of three-dimensional puzzles while engaging in dialogue with USA contemporaries such as Frank Stella and Kenneth Nolan. In Aus den Sieben Tagen, concentric color stripes undulate across a diptych to create 15 circles against a royal blue field. Named after Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's experimental compositions, which replace musical scores with intuition-based instructions, the work underscores Sakai's engagement with sound, movement, and conceptual experimentation. The interweaving of Japanese motifs, Latin American modernity, and post-war USA avant-garde reference complicates any narrow definition of arte latinoamericano, challenging the notion that globalism emerged only under neoliberalism. Sakai's practice foreground artistic agency shaped by migration and cultural curiosity rather than by a singular origin. Next, please. A parallel tension between local and global frameworks emerged in the reception of Rufino Tamayo. At the inauguration of Mexico City's Museo de Arte Moderno, his homenaje a la raza india occupied a central position, affirming his status as both a national and international figure redefining Mexican art. Locally, Tamayo was seen as embodying a national ethos through indigenous motifs expressed in a modernist language. Next. Critics such as Gomez Sicre and Robert Goldwater situated his work within a discourse of Latin American art. Gomez Sicre described Tamayo, an artist like Alejandro Obregón and Fernando de Cislo, as forging a plastic Esperanto that combined pre-Columbian traditions, Western formal motifs, and elements of popular art to articulate national spirits. Tamayo's distance from the Mexican school of painting, for Gomez Sicre, reflected a desire to deploy an international languages as a way of acknowledging rather than denying his mestizaje. Next. Goldwater similarly argued that Tamayo's internationalism was not divorced from his roots, but supported a search for universal discourses grounded in Mexican imagery. Tamayo's indigeneity, however, remained ambiguously framed, variously attributed to his Zapotec ancestry, or his work at the Museo Nacional de Antropología, or his collection of pre-Hispanic objects, or art historical constructions of ancestry and atavism. Peruvian critic Juan Hacha proposed that Tamayo's of operated simultaneously in three arenas: a local one shaped by debates on Mexican identity, a regional one defining Latin American culture, and the global arena where international critics and institutions integrated his work into broader art historical narratives. Next. A last study case can shed light around the contemporaneity of modern Latin American artists and their presence within global post-war avant-garde practices. Sara Grilo and José Antonio Fernández Muro, peers of Sakai in the Grupo de los Cinco, arrived in New York in 1962. According to Karen Grimson, Grilo incorporated language into her work as an embrace of the quotidian motifs absorbed in the USA metropolis, exerting her individuality beyond the physical act of painting. While printed elements populated her canvases as evidence of the artist's world, as it's seen in information that shows an advertisement of limited edition prints by modern artists sold at Macy's art department, it also evidences the artist's reflection of her own positioning within a genealogy of canonical art. But intertwining transfer news clips along with scribbles, lines, and gestural brushstrokes, Grillo manipulated her environment, positioning herself as a Latin American artist in the global context. Next, please. In contrast, Lilia Carrillo pursued experimentation through materiality and process. She layered in pastos, scratched painted surfaces, and incorporated sawdust, marble dust in drawings and transfer images. In the early 1960s, collaborations with Manuel Felgueres and Alejandro Jodorowsky encouraged a ludic approach that emphasized experimentation, collage, and assembled materials. Her 1960 exhibition at the OAS showed a skillful application of veiled layers of paint, combining them with sgraffito to reveal underlaying layers, adding depth and texture to her atmospheric compositions. In the late 1960s, artworks like Coleccionando Insectos and El Niño Crisálida integrated insect wings and organic material into the canvas, exemplifying her interest in expanding what material and processes like collagen textiles, aluminum foil, and cross-stitching could be considered adequate for artistic practice. Juxtaposing Grilo and Carrillo highlights shared strategies that exceed reductive categorizations of peripherality. While Grillo reflected on her own presence in hegemonic New York, her transfer works aimed to structure the experience of an artist within street signs, billboards, and commercial advertisements. On the other side, Carrillo focused her practice in Mexico City, a cosmopolitan region where a new generation of artists challenged canonical notions of national identity, while engaging with cultural projects across the Americas. Recent global studies in art history have increasingly addressed the complexities of Latin American modernism and its asynchronous development in relation to canonical centers, contesting narratives that cast these practices as mere derivatives. In the catalogue of the paradigmatic exhibition Post-War, Art Between the Pacific and the Atlantic, Andrea Junta argued that global post-war practices dismantle the notion of center and peripheries by carrying the same conceptual references and technical strategies that distinguish them from the historical avant-garde. In the same publication, Mari Carmen Ramirez defines South American concretism as an alternative modernism and a reframing practice that participated in national modernization projects. The historization of global modernisms has challenged the normalization of Western epistemology, which defines any subsequent manifestations as iterations of a canonical history. Historian Parta Mitter has argued that although the turn to universalism in studies of non-Western arts has preserved the tenets of Western culture, emerging nations have deployed modernist languages to counter imperialist efforts, adapting these artistic languages to their local context. By following this perspective, this essay recontextualizes Latin American modernism as an asynchronous process shaped by local and hemispheric circumstances, and mediated by individuals exercising an agency across divergent dialogues. Artists consolidated local scenes while actively participating in the construction of global contemporaneity. The cases discussed here demonstrate how practices emerging from distinct modernizing processes resist confinement within a singular notion of Latin American art. Next, please. In this context, reaffirming the category of arte latinoamericano, particularly in Spanish, becomes a critical act of cultural and historiographic self-definition. Unlike transnational labels anchored to hegemonic markets or institutional circuits that often privilege economic visibility over epistemic plurality, arte latinoamericano enables the region to narrate its own stories, dismantle inherited notions of center or periphery, and acknowledge regional spaces, minority voices, and alternative genealogies. Reinforcing the notion of arte latinoamericano in an era of market nationalisms and retraction to national borders can reignite the collaborative networks built by artists to respond and adapt to these political turmoils. It will also evidence the contemporaneity of artistic practices emerging from local scenes and the migration of cultural agents, artists, and ideas that support a cultural structure without needing external validation. By resisting homogenization and embracing plurality, Arte Latinoamericano affirms Latin America as a native agent in the construction of global modernity rather than as its peripheral or derivative echo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marco Polo. I will now invite our session one speakers to come back on video. And we'll be opening it up to our audience members for a Q&A session now. You can submit questions two ways. Feel free to use the raise your hand feature, or you can put it in the chat as well. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you to speak to our speakers. So I'll give everyone a couple moments to collect their thoughts, gather some questions. Our speakers can drink some water because I know you did a lot of talking just now. And I will keep an eye out for questions. I'm happy to start with a question that I had for our second speaker, Ronan, actually. The masks you mentioned, the photographs that we saw of the masks were, like gallery photographs. I was wondering in your research if you had encountered any of them worn or in a performance, and if so, how differently did that activate the objects?
Can you say the second part of your question again? I didn't quite catch it.
Oh, sorry. If you did encounter any of the masks actually worn or in performance, how did that kind of change the context for you and seeing them in the photographs and just what you mentioned of, them being used to kind of activate a liminal space. So, yeah.
So I haven't actually seen some of the masks myself because they're in a private collection. I have seen masks that he made. I did an archival research trip to Mexico, but I didn't see like mask one in particular because that's in the Blaisdell collection, which is it's weird because it's kind of a private collection that's owned by a university, but it's not always on view. Sometimes it's traveling. But in my research, I did encounter images of the masks being hung on a wall, and there's anecdotal archival evidence that other stridentists wrote about the masks being worn, but as far as I know, there's no photograph of them being worn specifically. I do know that the cardboard and paper mache masks that I showed, it's possible to wear them. It's possible to put them on, but the metal masks that he made after he moved to Paris, I don't believe it's possible to put those on. But he worked in a range of different styles and modalities of the mask. Some masks were made of metal, some were made of wood, some were made of paper mache, some were made of cardboard, and the lighter ones, like the metal masks, it might be possible, like in theory, to wear them, but they're so heavy and probably so uncomfortable that to wear them isn't practical. But I do know that they wore them to stage performances. Arce was really inspired by Dada, and Cueto was aware of Dada. He'd been to Europe a number of times before he moved to Paris in 1927. His cousin Maria Blanchard was a Spanish sculptor, and they were close. We have a lot of letters between them, and he had been to Europe and had seen like the Dadaists in Paris before he moved to Paris in 1927. So the possibility of wearing the mask and using it as a performance was something on his mind as he was making the original cardboard masks. But I didn't find any photographic evidence that yes, this was a mask that was worn, but I found literary evidence from Arce and others saying these were worn. We did have performances, and then there's photos of there's like they had they exhibited and had performances in a space called the Café de Nadie, which was a cafe in, I believe, the Roma Norte um, neighborhood of Mexico City, or this. I don't remember exactly where the cafe was, but it was a space, and they had performances there. They had exhibitions, and there are photographs of that space where you do see the masks hung on the wall. Um, but photographs of them being worn, I haven't encountered that.
Thank you. We have another question from Katie in the chat box. She says, thank you to all four of our speakers. I'm interested to hear more about what role the Pan-American Union and later the AMA played in helping to spread a certain idea of Latin American modernism in the 20th and 21st century. I think this is addressed to any and all four speakers. So if you would like to answer, feel free to chime in.
I can say a word. I was lucky to collaborate with Ama for some time while I was doing my PhD and doing research, looking at the exhibitions, their archive, and all the work that their directors did since the 50s, 60s, 70s to enforce or invite artists from the region to exhibit and be collected in the East Coast preceded a lot of efforts that other institutions like MoMA or the Guggenheim, the Fine Art Museums of Boston have done later to foster a Latin American collection. So in that way, I think that it's very telling to see Ama's collection in comparison to MoMA, for example, and see what kind of interest had Gomez Sicre in collecting artists with from different spaces, as Lola Fernandez presented today, or the Japanese Brazilian artists as Manabu Mabe or Tomi Otake that have just started to be integrated in other encyclopedic collections way later. So in that way, I feel that it's a great example to see how during the 60s and the 70s there was a interest in collecting certain artists and how the collection, Ama's collection, can say a lot about how the region was seen by a transregional institution and how certain artists from the Caribbean, Central America, Bolivia, Paraguay, countries that are not traditionally seen, are already part of Ama's collection.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to answer that question, or I can move on to the next one as well? Okay. We have a question from one of our next session speakers. Carlos, would you like to pose a question to Marco Polo?
Yes, thank you. And thank you all to all the speakers for your presentations today. Very interesting work. My question is to Marco Polo, but any of the other speakers can share their impressions as well. I'm curious to hear if you have any opinions about this or information about this. One of the things that I thought I heard you speak about, Marco Polo, and feel welcome to correct me if I misinterpreted you, is a development in tandem of Latin American and national identities. Thinking specifically on your slide of Huanacha, I think that you were pointing to something like that. And I'm wondering if I'm hearing correctly and if you will speak more to that.
Thank you, Carlos. No, you're correct. I think that Juan Hacha analyzing the case of Rufino Tamayo being positioned in three different frameworks at the same time kind of give us an example of how there was this expansion, this tension between how to categorize Latin American artists and how to put them in different contexts. Because if we go back to this analysis of Tamayo, he's been redefined inside the country by contemporaries that saying that his work is not Mexican enough or that he's not following the ideas and ideology of the Mexican School of Painting. Then in a regional arena, he's participating in a new redefinition of Latin American art that is being done by collecting practices. His past production allowed him to do prints at the Tamarind Institute in New Mexico, to have residences in New York, to work in different arenas, and that also contributed to this idea of some kind of global approach to Latin American art, and then the international concept of being recognized by the market and the museums as a top artist. So in that way, there's a lot of circumstances that we need to analyze when we look at these artists and how one single collection or one single perspective don't allow us to look at them through all these tensions existing at the same time.
Okay, our next question comes from the AMA Director and Curator of Modern Movements, Adriana.
Thank you very much, Rosa, and thank you very much to all the panelists. It was wonderful to listen all these different perspectives. Very, very exciting. And when you see the pieces of the collection there, and with new scholarship, it is thrilling. But my question is for like a comment that goes for Alejandro. And thank you very much for your presentation. And first, let me tell you, I am very happy to see a scholarship being produced about Central America. I think it is time. We are overdue with that. And I'm very, very happy. And I'm also very happy to see so many artists of our collection being represented. I'm just like curious how you pick up the different artists. Dutari, I'm actually working on Dutari right now for an exhibition that we're gonna launch in Panama in the summer. And I just want to hear more about the process of how you came to this field, to the selection of this particular artist. I just found your paper fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. It is certainly needed, and it's an absolutely an understudied region. I have been working on Central American modernism for quite a bit now. I started back home in Costa Rica, working only on Costa Rican modernism. That's the way I learned about the OAS AMA collection and particularly the influence of Gómez Sicre. And then for my doctoral project, I proposed more, I don't want to call it a survey, but how we have been dealing and talking about Central American modernism regarding the Latin American canon, and how does, as Marco Polo was saying, how those tensions emerge when it comes to dominant accounts of modernism from, I don't know, Mexico or Argentina or Brazil, in comparison to a region that is, historically marginalized, and from a region where most of the artists that are acknowledged have to be recognized by institutions like AMA, and by figures like Gómez Sicre, to really become Latin American artists instead of just local, seminal figures in their own country. So, following up with the question of the influence of this collection, particularly, I would say that all the legendary figures of Central American art, modernist art, were sort of handpicked by a scholarship, a figure like Gómez Sicre, the Tamarind Institute, or got the Guggenheim Scholarship, and that was the only way in which they were able to engage in like broader, more international circuits. That being said, I sort of decided to go with these 6 artists just because they were included in the collection you have. I wasn't sure how many of them were going to be part of the exhibition, and I was very happy that at least 2 of the artworks were included. But yeah, to answer the question in summary, I have been working on at least 75 artists from Central America from 1910 to They were born, sorry, they were born between 1895 and 1935. That is a very arbitrary period. But there's a hypothetical position in the region that apparently in 1971 we stopped being modernist and became contemporary, which of course is arbitrary and absurd. But yeah, most of the artists that were working on that period are the ones that are of interest. So yeah, that's the rationale behind it.
Thank you, Alejandro. We have about 10 more minutes for any additional questions. Yes, Marco Polo?
I would like to hear more from Alejandro's presentation regarding local institutions. Have you seen or have you able to map some efforts from Central American museums in building? It's funny that we are like sometimes creating this idea of Latinoamericano that a lot of times omits Central America or the Caribbean, and there's a lot of efforts in the Caribbean to foster its own definition. So I will be grateful if you share with us like what is happening in local institutions, if there's like somebody spearheading acquiring, studying, exhibiting Central American art in that specific area?
Well, I would say that Central American art, right now, contemporary Central American art is hot in a sense. It's been getting some attention from global events, biennales, and that sort of stuff. And that has been pushed perhaps since the late 90s, early 2000s by certain figures. I can speak with more, I don't know, authority about my country. Teoretica in San Jose has been one very, very important institution, research center, which pushed the reconsideration of Central America as a hub of cultural production in the belly bottom of the Americas, and that has tried to reformulate its own history. However, I think their influence and also new initiatives such as La Fábrica in Guatemala, they have focused more on everything produced after the 70s, which and that is one of the main criticisms that I have made on the historiography of the region is the fact that we have been in a very strange way able to produce a history of contemporary art and a history of colonial and republican art from Central America, but the first half of the 20th century is a void. And I would say that museums, especially national museums in Central America, have tried to to preserve their artworks, their heritage, and create a certain national canon in each country. That happens at the MAC in Panama, at the MUNAM in Guatemala, Marte in El Salvador. But from my point of view, they are always lacking the intercalation, the networked approach, the way in which these artists were all engaged in perhaps similar avant-garde circuits. They were engaging with Europeans or North American. Mexico is crucial in this sense. but they were working along other Central Americans in those transnational contexts. So I think that is the work that is still to be done, and well, in a certain way, the field that I intend to contribute on.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Which I am happy to, oh, there we go. Diana, let me allow you to talk. Diana, feel free to ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you, everyone, for your incredibly interesting papers. My question is, and anyone can answer, I'm an Ecuadorian artist, and I'm curious as to how do you find artists from Ecuador or from Central America? Is it difficult today to have galleries either in Europe or the United States show work from artists that are just emerging artists, for example, from countries like Ecuador or Costa Rica, Peru, and I notice sometimes when you go to the auctions or Christie's or Sotheby's or something like that, they are now showing some Latin American artists, but not so much. So do you find that collectors are looking now more for Latin American artists as opposed to European artists or American artists? Has the market changed? And how do you find that? I'm just curious if anyone has any perspective about this.
Ginerva?
Yeah, I thank you truly much. It's a very, very compelling and complex question. I'm working actually in different kind here in São Paulo, in different kind of spaces that are alternative spaces. It means there are not galleries, but there are a different kind of circuits that is working, especially with the young. I'm talking about Brazilian artists, very young Brazilian artists, because in Latin America there's not this kind of dialogue between the gallery spaces and the institution abroad and inside Brazil, as well as there is no, for instance, an activity, a very specific activity of portfolio review or of growing up of artists from the academic milieu, from the academic dimension to the market dimension or the institutional dimension, first of all, inside Brazil. So if I may tell you, the most the easiest and the most difficult way to get abroad from a Latin American emerging artist point of view is just to work a lot, and I am working a lot on this front, working a lot on scholarships. There are many residencies, first of all, that Latin American artists could apply, especially in Berlin, if I may say, in Alemania. That could help in some way to create contacts and to create a visibility, to create an identity. It's very much an effort that all of the Latin American artist has to do, because unfortunately they have to speak a very fluent English, they have to get represented by a professor or by a curator or an art historian, and try to find this kind of leap into the abroad. Let's talk about Europe, for instance, as a way to produce another kind of language of their own work, because unfortunately the rhythm and the path and the pace that Europe offers is different. But if I may just give you a tiny little answer to your very important question, residencies and scholarship are a very first good step. Then from there, I would suggest to start talking with the galleries who has a foreign front, as galleries that in Latin America participates to foreign fairs, for instance, or they have other artists who are emerging artists who are active in other countries. I'm talking about Vermelho for Brazil, Mendes Wood. Of course, it's difficult. If I may talk you quantitatively, just Gentil Carioca received 6,000 portfolios from emerging artists from all over the world each month. So I just would rather tell you, just work on your portfolio, work on finding scholarships and scholarships and residencies abroad, and just apply as many as possible, and try to work with an art historian or a curator that could give you a kind of chronogram, a kind of timeline in order to understand which would be your eventual path abroad. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ginerva. And just a special thank you to all four speakers, Alejandro, Ronan, Ginerva, Marco Polo. That was an amazing first session. We'll be taking a short 10-minute break, and I want to ask everyone to rejoin us again at 11:10. 11:10, we will be introducing our second session and just kicking off with Ayelen. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon. Okay, hello everyone. We will be starting our second session, which is on identity and reframing the hemisphere. Before we start off, I will introduce our three speakers, Ayelen, Rachel, and Carlos, who will be presenting in the session. And I would like to remind our audience members to hold their questions until the end of the last presentation, where we will open the floor for another Q&A. Our first speaker is Ayelen Pagnanelli, who is an associate researcher at Centro de Investigaciones en Arte Patrimonio, Universidad Nacional de San Martín, where she co-coordinates the Art, Gender, and Diversity area. She is a professor in the master's program in Image Studies and Photographic Archives at UNSAM and the master's program in History of Argentine and Latin American Art at EIDAES UNSAM as well. Pagnanelli received her PhD and MA in Art History from Universidad Nacional de San Martín and a BA in Gender Studies and Studio Art from Skidmore College. She was an honorable mention in the 2022 Peter C. Marzio Award for Outstanding Research in Latin American and Latino Art from the International Center for the Arts of Americas at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, Texas. In 2025, she was a visiting postdoctoral researcher at the Kunsthistorisches Institut, Universidad Zurich. Our second speaker will be Rachel Remick, who currently works as a curatorial assistant in the Department of Curatorial Affairs at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, where she helps oversee the rotating presentations of the museum's collection. At MoMA, she helped organize the forthcoming Frida and Diego, The Last Dream, and in 2024, Lily P. Bliss and the Birth of the Modern. Previously, she served as the assistant curator at Art at America Society in New York, where she co-organized several exhibitions, including Sylvia Palacios Whitman, To Draw a Line with the Body 2023. Her writing has been published by several venues, including the Brooklyn Rail and Hyperallergic.com. Rachel holds a master's in art history from the Center for Latin American Visual Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, where her research focused on modern and contemporary Latin American and U.S. Latinx art. Our final speaker of session 2 will be Carlos Antonio-Colón, who is a visual artist from Puerto Rico and currently lives in Savannah, Georgia. He holds an MFA in painting from Savannah College of Art and Design, where he also recently completed an MA in art history. His research interests include 20th century Latin American art, care ethics, aesthetics, and the artist's role in society and the history of their professionalization. His graduate thesis traced the relational voice in 20th century Latin American art. Colón has also held teaching positions at SCAD and the University of South Carolina, Beaufort. And now I will turn it over to Ayelen.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, all the organizers and all the other panelists. It has been a really thrilling morning over here from Buenos Aires, listening to all of you. So I will be talking about Sara Grilo. So Rosa, if you can go to the next slide. So she was a key figure of post-war abstraction in the Americas and one of the many young women immersed in the exploration of abstract visual languages, moving away from the rigidity of geometry that emerged in 1940s in Buenos Aires. Stemming from my doctoral dissertation, I will analyze the strategies carried out by Grilo and by some of her peers and the factors that contributed to a very special episode in the history of post-war abstraction. I argue that Grilo, along with several women artists, was part of a unique moment where youth, gender, and abstraction conflated to achieve a relevant space of visibility in modern art. Prior to her stay in New York, thanks to a Guggenheim grant in the 1960s, during the second half of the 50s, Grilo was part of a group of young women artists that emerged as rising stars of the abstract scene in Buenos Aires. Some of these women received a fair amount of recognition and success, while some forged sustained careers and have been included in our history, such as Marta Minujín and, perhaps to a lesser extent, Josefina Rovirosa or Alicia Penalba. Others have remained largely unattended, such as Noemí Gerstein or Marta Pelufo. Against the idea that all women artists of the past held minor positions and did not stand out, I argue that during the 50s and early 60s, some women achieved notable positions thanks to their abstract production, insertion into the local scene, stays in global art centers, and early acceptance by critics and museums. However, this recognition did not necessarily translate into an inscription in our histories, since later only one artist, Marta Minujín, became an exceptional figure whose success eclipsed that of her peers in historical and institutional narratives. Next slide. In the second half of the 50s, when abstract art found a much more favorable position in Buenos Aires, opportunities for women artists emerged. In this scenario, Minujín, Rovirosa, Grilo, Pelufo, Gerstein, and even from Paris, Penalba, found themselves at a hinge moment in the conditions of public visibility for women artists. This did not occur in isolation from a certain social, political, and economic environment that favored, without being the direct explanation for this phenomenon. It was in a context in which the visual arts, especially modern art, and women and youth occupied a central role. In fact, in Western countries, youth began to acquire social protagonism after World War II and consolidated in Argentina in the late 50s and 60s. Youth became the main subject of the modernizing project, traversed by new consumption practices and the eruption of new cultural expressions like rock and roll music. Women especially had experienced social changes in the prior years. In 1947, the sanction of the law allowing them to vote and become political representatives opened spaces for political participation and for leadership for women. This created a panorama that broadened the horizon of women's public political activity in Argentina. Although there was no radical change in the discourse around women's lives and expected social roles, it affected the experiences of young women from all socioeconomic groups. Young women enter university education and the workforce in greater numbers. This was not only an economic transformation, but ways of socializing also changed. The women who achieved recognition in the art scene were not only women, but were mostly young. It is necessary to mention that also most of these young women artists belong to current socioeconomic groups. Next. While measuring the impact of life choices and interpersonal relationships remains elusive, it is evident that such factors influence the lives and professional trajectories of some of these women artists. For example, both Grilo and Minujín were mothers and wives. In the construction of Minujín's public image, she is typically portrayed as a single, independent woman, despite being married with children. In contrast, Grilo's biographies consistently begin their narrative after her marriage to fellow artist Fernández Muro. Her life and artistic production prior to marriage are rarely addressed. One instance in which her private life reemerges in the literature concerns how her move to New York affected family daily life. It was her professional career that motivated the relocation, and she subsequently became the head of the household. Next. Returning to the political context of the second half of the 1950s, this represented institutional rupture and the proscription of Peronism. In 1955, with the so-called Revolución Libertadora, a coup d'etat overthrew Juan Domingo Perón. Much of the Buenos Aires art scene read this change as the advent of a freedom lost during the Peronist years. In this scenario, it is worth recalling that in 1956, Raquel Forner was awarded the Grand Prize of Honor at the National Salon thanks to El Envío. The painting reflected the geometric explorations she was developing and that were in vogue. The institutional recognition of a woman artist became emblematic of the new government's symbolic freedoms. A panorama of state support for the visual arts then opened, which was articulated around the excess of novelty, youth, and internationalization. In 1956, the Museum of Modern Art in Buenos Aires inaugurated its activities. The Buenos Aires scene began opening to abstract proposals early in the decade, but institutional push for abstraction intensified in the post-Peronist period. Jorge Romero Brest went on to head the National Museum of Fine Arts and manage the Argentine submission to the Venice Biennale. He privileged the inclusion of young artists working within abstract tendencies, including Sara Grilo. So there was state support in the post-Peronist period that accompanied this abstract poetics, from which some few women actually benefited. Next. Abstraction was the unifying aesthetics of the artists who achieved certain recognition in the second half of the 50s. Geometric abstraction no longer represented the avant-garde of 10 years earlier, so it is not surprising that the artists who deployed more organic abstractions were at the center of attention. Perhaps the woman artist closest to that geometric abstraction of the 40s in the mid-50s was Grilo. She began her career exhibiting figurative work, then abstractions in which she disturbed the rigidity of the grid through rhythmic and chromatic explorations where color was reconfigured multiple times, at times applied extensively, and also incorporated chord forms throughout the canvas. Later, Grilo remained within non-figuration, to which she would later add letters and graffiti. It is coincidental that the artists who enjoyed certain visibility and recognition in Buenos Aires during this time were those who developed abstract work across a plurality of tendencies. But producing abstract work alone was not enough. This work had to circulate. Next, please. The works of these artists found its way into the Buenos Aires scene mainly through its circulation in exhibition spaces. Group formation was one of the main strategies of avant-garde artists to achieve visibility, and so Grilo was part of first the Grupo de Artistas Modernos of Argentina, or GAMA, along with Lili Prati, Tomás Maldonado, Hans Sevi, José Antonio Fernández Muro, Claudio Girola, Alfredo Lito, Enio Yomi, and Miguel Ocampo. And Grilo exhibited several times with this group both in Buenos Aires and internationally. She was also part of a collective exhibition at the National Museum of Fine Arts in 1960 with José Fernández Muro, Miguel Ocampo, Kazuya Sakai, and Clorindo Testa, artists who had not formed a group but exhibited together as at the museum. In one photograph, Grilo appears at the very center of the image, surrounded by men. Again, the only women in a group formed by men, formed by where her husband also was part of. So it was an all-male group except Grilo. She exhibited collectively in groups that often, in shows that often took place in commercial art galleries that also opened doors for solo exhibitions and commercial support. Grilo exhibited at the workshop of Vicente Puig at the early 40s in Whitcomb Gallery in Buenos Aires. Then, having resided in Madrid and Paris in the late 40s, her first solo exhibition was in the Spanish capital in 1949. Then in 1950 at Piau Gallery in Buenos Aires, but she did not exhibit solo again up until 1955 in Cride Gallery. From then onwards, she began showing at the prestigious Bonino Gallery, which she did in 1958, 61, and 63. Art competitions were key to gaining recognition in the local scene, but awards were elusive to women. In 1958, critic Damián Bayón referred to this effect in the catalog text for Grilo's solo exhibition at Bonino, and I quote, "By now, she should have won one of the most important prizes. It is an open secret. Everybody knows it, the public and the juries." End of quote. And yet Grilo did not win prizes in Argentine competitions during this time. Bayón's enunciation regarding the absence of formal recognition from the local circuit towards Grilo work is curious. But Bayón comments evidences that the artist insisted on participation in competitions. Next slide. So this is the photograph that I was referring about the exhibition at the National Museum of Fine Arts. International exposure, besides offering new possibilities abroad, provided Argentine artists with greater legitimacy locally. In fact, internationalism defined Argentine art of the 60s. This process becomes visible in the numerous opportunities of exchange in artist trajectories. One main strategy was including the works in exhibitions outside of Argentina. The second strategy was the physical relocation to global centers of art production, such as Paris or New York. As early as 1957, Grilo traveled through Europe and the US, exhibiting at the Pan American Union in Washington, D.C., the Pittsburgh International Biennial, a gallery in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, Caracas, Venezuela, Boston, New York, Madrid. But after settling in New York in 1963, she exhibited at Bianchini Gallery in New York, Washington, D.C., Lima, Peru, and Bogota, Colombia as well. So often, artists made trips with fellowship support, and for Grilo, obtaining the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1961 marked a turning point in her trajectory. Thanks to it, she settled in New York until the 70s, building an international platform. In the span of 10 years, Grilo positioned herself as an artist in the US and consolidated her presence in the Argentine scene, exhibiting assiduously at Bonino. Next slide, please. In terms of institutional acquisitions, Grilo's work is found in several public collections in Argentina, Spain, the US, and South America. The National Museum of Fine Arts owns 3 of her works. The first was acquired from the artist through Bonino and probably entered the same year of its execution in 1958, Pintura en Rojos, which I showed earlier. The second, Pintura, was acquired with a subsidy from the National Fund for the Arts, directed from the artist in 1967. And the third is a work from 1967, acquired after donation in 1977. The Sybori Museum, the Museum of Modern Art Buenos Aires, and the Genaro Pérez Museum in Córdoba both own early works, indicating her almost immediate institutionalization in Argentina. Due to her residence in Spain, it is not surprising that several Iberian museums own her works, but what is striking is the unusual speed in which museums, including the National Museum of Fine Arts, acquire her work, legitimizing her production. The artwork of OAS is also from the second half of the 50s and shares formal similarities to those at the National Museum of Fine Arts. Next slide. As a way to conclude, during the 1950s and early 60s, Sara Grilo, along with a few women artists, enjoyed visibility and a certain degree of recognition from the local scene. A social context where women were acquiring rights and a greater participation in the public space and a beneficial political context converged to create a moment that served as an impulse for some women making abstract art. The indicators detailed throughout point to these women having possibilities of visibility, circulation, awards, and acquisitions. That is a fair share of artistic success. Grilo capitalized on her experiences in New York and her subsequent residence in Madrid through museum acquisitions. Though regarding her insertion into our historical narratives, our historian curator Karen Grimson has suggested that Grilo, and I quote, remained independent even when she associated with groups of artists, generating an impossibility of incorporating her into the groupings and classifications that mark the writings of the discipline. End of quote. Thus, even if Grilo managed to group with men as a strategy to exhibit, these groupings later made it difficult for her to find a comfortable place in our histories. Nonetheless, she has attracted curatorial and international market interest that continues to consolidate to this day. In the end, the case of Sara Grilo reveals a paradox, a moment of genuine recognition and success for women abstract artists in post-war Argentina, followed by a historical eclipse in which only one exceptional figure, Marta Minujín, remained visible. The strategies these women deployed, group formations, solo exhibitions, competition participation, international travel, fellowships, and museum acquisitions, were effective in their own time. Their subsequent marginalization in our historical narrative speaks less to the quality or ambition of their work and careers and more to the structures of our history. Recovering this moment in post-war abstraction by looking at Sara Grilo challenges us to rethink how we write the history of abstraction in the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayelen. Next up, my apologies. We have Rachel.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Let me know if you can hear me okay. So, can I have the next slide, please? Brazilian artist Maria Martins arrived in the United States when her husband, diplomat Carlos Martins Pereira y Souza, became ambassador to the country. In her personal life, Martins navigated the social worlds of diplomacy and cultural exchange. In her art, Martins returned often to Brazilian themes and ideas of cultural identity. Next slide, please. My presentation will focus on Martins' sculpture Boiuna and its exhibition in a 1943 show called Maria New Sculptures at the Valentine Gallery in New York City. Through analysis of her sculpture Boiuna and its reception, my talk will build on existing scholarship to examine the complex cultural tensions Martins navigated. When Martins and her husband relocated to the US, Martins created a makeshift art studio in the attic of the Brazilian embassy in Washington, D.C. From the start of her life in the United States, Martins' artistic world was intertwined with her diplomatic life. In 1941, she presented her first solo exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. at the age of 47. That same year, Martins set up a studio in Manhattan, where sculptor Jacques Lipschitz introduced her to bronze casting, and her professional life as an artist really kicked into high gear. Next slide, please. Boiuna depicts a serpentine figure covered in orifices and mouths. Martins gives the creature appendages that also end in mouths, 2 from the upper half that function like arms, and 2 that emerge from the lower half of the body and can be confused with vegetation or vines emerging from the bottom of the sculpture. Next slide, please. The head has a large mouth and tiny curved forms protruding, you're seeing that in the detail on the right, evoking a Medusa-like head of snakes. These gaping mouths refer to the meaning of the word Boiuna, which is a name of the cobra grande, or the mythical snake said to live in the Amazon. The Boiuna hunts people in versions of the myth, and in some tales is also said to have the power to change its form in order to trick its victims. Next slide, please. Martins' sculpture attempts to capture the setting and the shape-shifting nature of the form through the undulating ground and the wave-like form behind the figure, as if it depicts the moment the snake rises from the river to attack its prey. This changes in form is also partially due to the technique that Martins used for this sculpture, a lost wax casting technique in bronze that allowed the artist's marks in the clay mold to show through in the final cast. Next slide, please. The lower section of the body opens in the shape of a vagina dentata. This idea of a sharp-toothed vagina has a long folkloric tradition and was part of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theories, wherein it was symbolic of male fears around women's sexuality. It was a well-known symbol in the surrealist circles that Martins was a part of in the United States and similarly represented the monstrous feminine. Martins further underscores the femininity of the boyuna in this representation by adding breasts to the body that are also carved at the end with additional orifices. In this way, Martins positions the mythical snake as a cipher of feminine violence and power. Next slide, please. Martins created boyuna in 1942 as part of a series of sculptures referencing indigenous mythological and/or Afro-Brazilian religious figures that she associated with the Amazon region in Brazil. These works were exhibited in 1943 as part of the exhibition Maria New Sculptures at Valentine Gallery. To accompany the exhibition, she published Amazonia by Maria. In the introductory text, Martins describes a mythological story of the renewal of the rainforest, concluding, quote, "Now the forest will live for another year, stronger, more mysterious, more brilliant, and more somber, guarding within its virgin breast the secret riches coveted by men," end quote. Martins immediately sets up a vision of the Amazon as a fantastic landscape and reinforces the ideas that it is both mysterious and empty of complex civilization, but also guarding untold riches, inadvertently reinforcing the mythological underpinnings of the resource extraction reaching new heights during World War II. Next slide, please. For each artwork included in the publication, Martins authors a short text describing her version of the myth or story associated with that figure. In Martins's telling, Yara, pictured here, is the siren of the Amazon who lures mortals to their death. Next slide. Yamanya is the goddess of creation, tormented by the forbidden advances of her son and hides in the depths of the ocean. You can see here the text plate and the image plate from the publication. Next slide. The Cobra Grande is described as the goddess over all the deities of Amazonia, whose son is the river Amazon. Next slide. For Boyuna, Martins writes in part, quote, "When in the dark tropical night of the Amazon, the silence is rent by a howl that makes the hair stand on end and the flesh creep. It is the returning Boyuna, the monster snake. It is Boyuna on her prophetic rounds, killing men. Boyuna with her innumerable mouths sucking their blood, draining their strength," end quote. Martins' textual description of Boyuna further emphasizes the violence and power she sought to convey visually in the sculpture. Next slide. Together, the artworks in the publication argue for Martins as a translator of Brazilian culture in the artistic scene in New York. In certain passages, Martins introduces a first-person I narration of the myths, creating the perception of herself as an authoritative narrator of these traditions. She also invited Jorge Sorur, then the director of the Conselho Nacional de Geografia, to write the foreword, which lent the publication further authority. Zarur writes, in part, quote, "The Amazon practiced a sincere and wholehearted good neighbor policy long before the idea occurred to the men of the Americas. This great river forms a bond between Brazil and the other South American nations and conveys the Brazilian soil from the warm heart of Brazil to faraway countries." Zarur's text not only describes the Amazon in the preceding passages, but also curiously positions this body of work as part of a larger Pan-American dialogue, and interestingly poses the Amazon region as a model for hemispheric unity, a narrative befitting the turbulent context of World War II in which this publication was created. But simultaneously, it may have also been a reflection of ideas being circulated in Getulio Vargas's government as part of the Estado Novo, which sought to create a more unified national identity through a cultural fusion of Portuguese, indigenous, and African cultures, which comprised Brazil. This context further illuminates why scholar Joanna Fiducia framed this body of work as diplomatic objects, in which Martins is creating physical mediations of this national identity. Next slide, please. It is no surprise that this piece quickly became a part of the personal collection of Nelson Rockefeller, who was deeply entrenched in the complex diplomatic and political exchanges of the Americas during this period, and was patron to many artists from the region. Here you can see Boyuna exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, as part of Rockefeller's personal collection. It is on the far left in profile. He eventually donated this sculpture to the Art Museum of the Americas. Zur's introduction and the circulation of this work at the time evidenced Martins' success in purveying Brazilian culture in diplomatic circles. Artistically, however, Maria New Sculptures had a mixed reception. In the New York Times, critic Edward Allen Jewell was not in favor of the exhibition. He did not resonate with the subject matter and suggested Martins' works would have made more sense as paintings. Next slide, please. For Vogue, Martins was profiled less as an artist and more as the ambassador's unusual wife. The article states, quote, Senora C. Martins Pereira y Souza leads a three-ringed life in Washington. Small, dark, and with just a trace of a soft Portuguese accent, she divides her days between her three young daughters, her creative life, and her diplomatic duties, end quote. As was common at the time, she is referred to by her married name, which indicates why in her artistic life she often went by the mononym Maria. Next slide, please. But more importantly, the author makes sure in this article to highlight Martins' otherness, describing her as small and dark. And it's illustrated by the image of Boyuna here that you can see in this detail from the magazine spread, alongside photos of the residents in Washington, D.C. The article ends advertising the show at Valentine Gallery, describing the body of work as representing, quote, mythological figures of the Amazon region, vigorous, fantastic, primitive imagery of Senora Martins' great country. While emphasizing Martins' role as a representative of Brazilian culture, it also underscores the perception of indigenous cultures from Brazil as both fantastic and primitive, using an image of Boyuna to illustrate the text. Next slide, please. Intriguingly, it is precisely both Martins' invocation of the so-called fantastic and primitive that caught the attention of exiled and displaced European surrealists in New York at the time, many of whom Martins befriended. After seeing the exhibition, our founder of Surrealism, André Breton, welcomed Martins to the Surrealist movement. He wrote in a text on her work from 1947, quote, in her bronzes I see Boyuna and Yamanya, Maria has succeeded marvelously in capturing at their primitive source not only anguish, temptation, fever, but also sunrise, happiness, calm, and even occasionally pure delight. Maria owes nothing to the sculpture of the past or present. She is far too sure for that of the original rhythm, which is increasingly lacking in modern sculpture. She is prodigal with what the Amazon has given her, the overwhelming abundance of life. For Breton, Maria's works like Boyuna were conduits to pre-modern indigenous cultures, which evoked a more true state of being than quote-unquote civilized Western culture. Breton's language rejects the temporality of Martins' work, with neither past nor present, and removes it from linear time, further emphasizing its otherness. For the Surrealists, Martins' artistic value was rooted in her otherness, which gave her further ability to access the pre-modern cultures they were so fascinated by. Next slide. Though Breton was certain of Martins as an eminent representative of Amazonia, Martins never visited the Amazon. In some accounts, she said she created the body of work after flying over the region in a plane and being awestruck by the verdant depths below. Scholar Maria Clara Bernal proposed in an analysis of Amazonia, the publication, that Martins, quote, represented Amazonia from the eyes of a foreigner. Perhaps she felt like a foreigner all her life, even in the country she was born. I would add to Bernal's interpretation to say that not only did Martins find in the Amazon a symbol for Brazil, but whatever her intentions may have been, she instrumentalized references to indigenous and Afro-Brazilian cultures to bolster her identity as a Brazilian artist for consumption by a non-Brazilian audience. It is precisely this that makes her such a slippery historical figure. Her life and her artistic life and diplomatic life are extremely intertwined in these early works. And her life as a representative of Brazil to an international audience bled into these sculptures. Similar to scholar Tirza True-Latimer's argument on Martins, the myth of Maria, the Brazilian artist that Martins created, is what helped elevate her career as a sculptor. Yet it also threatened to overwhelm her. Going forward, Martins' work would become more explicitly abstract, perhaps attempting to shake obvious associations with Brazilian culture. Next slide, please. Martins leaves us with more questions than answers regarding her motivations and artistic intentions. What if Martins, knowing how her contemporaries in New York would view her as an outsider, as evidenced in the Vogue profile, created the myth of Maria to own the narrative? Or what if, as Bernal gestures at, it was her way of connecting to her Brazilian identity from afar and negotiating its many facets after living much of her adult life abroad? Moreover, is there a deeper meaning to her almost exclusive focus in this body of work on the divine and monstrous feminine? Though she could have chosen any myths of the region, the majority chronicled in Amazonia relay stories of female goddesses who hunt and kill men. Could her interest in violent, powerful forms of seduction be an indirect reaction to how she herself was perceived as an exotic woman in New York? Martins seemed interested in a defiant sensibility of reclaiming and subverting stereotypes assigned to her. She titled another sculpture from the same period, "Never Forget I Come from the Tropics," using her mythology of herself as a shield. Next slide, please. Martins' artworks point to the complicated tensions between her identities as a woman, artist, Brazilian, diplomat, foreigner, and mother, among others. In a 1946 interview with Time magazine, Martins said, quote, "The world is complicated and sad. It is nearly impossible to make people understand each other," end quote. Though she was speaking about a later body of work, I feel it is a poignant description of Martins' own navigation of her multiple social roles. While we can only speculate at her true motivations and feelings, her artworks evidence an astute understanding of the negotiated nature of identity, in which identity is a dialectical relationship between what we project in the world and how others perceive us, and that this relationship can never fully be resolved. Next slide, please. And yet, Martins maintains some hope for art as a conduit for understanding. The following year, she wrote on behalf of a group of artists for a congressional address, quote, "Art is a liberation, not only for the artist, but for the admirer of art, the simple observer of artistic relations," end quote. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Our final presentation for today, or sorry, not today, this session, will be Carlos.
Thank you for your presentation, Rachel. And I want to express my appreciation and excitement to international arts and artists and the Art Museum of the Americas for this exhibition, Modern Movements, Selections of Latin American and Caribbean Art from the Art Museum of the Americas, curated by Adriano Spina. My deep appreciation to everyone making this event possible and to my colleagues participating today. And special thanks to Rosa Yang for coordinating, responding to emails, and making participation easy. We really appreciate it. I propose examining the manifestation of the relational voice in the lyrical abstraction of Fernando de Cildo and the geometric abstraction of Jesus Rafael Soto from the collection of the Art Museum of the Americas in order to explore how artists navigated the creative tensions that led to the development of Latin American art during the 20th century, and to offer a new lens through which to interpret the work in exhibitions like Modern Movements. Slide, please. These are the two artists, Fernando de Cildo, and the two artworks in the exhibition by Jesus Rafael Soto as well. Slide, please. The relational voice represents an underlying mode of ethical reasoning first identified by the American psychologist Carol Gilligan that prioritizes connection and context, and as such positions itself in stark contrast to the values centered by liberal individualism and Western ethics more generally, which systematically abstracts from an interconnected social reality. Slide, please. In Latin America, the relational voice is evidenced by a critical reinterpretation that shifts both theory and art away from the normative values of Western aesthetics to elevate endemic values in response to local contexts and relationships. I refer to this process as transvalorization. In this way, for example, the European concept of the avant-garde, driven by a narrative of the evolution of formal innovations, in Latin America becomes vanguardismo, where formal innovation on its own, when devoid of social content, is not understood to be avant-garde. Correspondingly, surrealism shifted away from the strictures of psychoanalysis and became rooted in the subjective experience of local realities, indigenous myths, literature, and mysticism. Likewise, concrete art promptly abandoned strict formalist rationalism to incorporate greater subjectivity, contextuality, and audience participation. This pattern of transvalorization recurs throughout Latin American art movements and theory, making the relational voice a fundamental unifying trait that has been made invisible by the dominance of Western narratives. I argue it is through the relational voice that the creative and intellectual production of Latin American modernism is revealed as coherent and original, and through which collections like the Art Museum of the Americas can find their grounding. By introducing the relational voice as a new lens, we can identify a pattern in Latin American art and theory for the transvalorization of Western concepts that adapts them to local contexts while prioritizing connections to community and personal relationships. The French curator Nicolas Bourriard uses a similar term, relational aesthetics, but relational aesthetics and the relational voice I am introducing today are two different concepts. Slide, please. Bourriard used the term relational aesthetics to describe artistic practices emerging in the 1990s that focused on the, quote, fleeting image issuing from collective behavior. For example, here we see Rikrit Trevanijas' Fear Eats the Soul, which transforms gallery spaces to serve soup to visitors in order to create a moment of conviviality. But relational aesthetics remains a formalist critique because to Bourriard, it does not aim to effect change, only to counter the aesthetic of alienation that permeates a society of the spectacle. Relational aesthetics for Bourriard remains a theory of form. The relational voice, on the other hand, does not describe or prescribe an aesthetic or style. It underlies the creative choices that drive individual artistic practice, art movements, and the theoretical reasoning behind Latin American scholarship. To understand the relational voice in a more concrete way, let's look at two examples where the relational voice is readily evident. This year's Super Bowl halftime show as an example of visual culture, and a painting by José Sabogal. Slide, please. Most might be familiar with Bad Bunny's show this year. The relational voice is evident in its centering of Puerto Rican history and culture, its intergenerational engagement, its showcase of community members, businesses, and their hosting of marriage and the hosting of a marriage ceremony. The performance also articulated multiple interconnected identities: national identity through language and Puerto Rican pride, Latin American solidarity, and a broader American identity that is inclusive of the United States and Canada and meant to reclaim a hemispheric Americanness. This conception aligns with the identity formation process in the 20th century Latin American art, where building a national identity often went hand in hand with articulating a broader pan-Latin American identity. Slide, please. 100 years earlier, we see the articulation of interconnected identities in Andean indigenism. Paintings like India del Collao by Peruvian painter José Sabogal served an important function challenging the primacy of European culture as the defining feature of Americanness, and in disentangling from the legacies of colonialism, as identified by art historian Michel Grit. Other examples of indigenism in Latin America include anthropophagy in Brazil and Mexican muralism. However, rather than view indigenism as a movement or style, Grit explains that indigenism should be viewed as a constantly evolving means for artists to, quote, negotiate distinct yet modern identity in an increasingly international cultural sphere. Indigenism sought the construction of identities distinct from Europe. In both Bad Bunny's show and indigenous painting, the relational voice is evident in their engagement with identity and the centering of community relationships. Slide, please. Indigenism is the foundation to Cildo's Cajamarca. Cildo based the painting on an anonymous elegy about the execution of Atahualpa, the last Inca, also symbolizing the end of the Incan Empire at the hands of Francisco Pizarro in 1533. Cajamarca is the place where Atahualpa was killed. Though pursuing modernism through abstraction, Cildo continued to look to pre-Columbian cultures, to myth, mysticism, and literature, remaining focused on identity and local context. As the AMA or AMA identifies on its website, quote, Cajamarca is a testimony of the social and realistic indigenism of a deep nationalization of the plastic vocabulary of the international avant-gardes, which constitutes Cildo's main contribution to Peruvian and Latin American art, end quote. Note the pairing of Peruvian and Latin American identities and the relational character of AMA's statement. Next slide, please. Here we see Soto's Escritura Hurtado from 1975, named after a friend also, by the way, featured in Modern Movements. In 1979, the Brazilian art critic Frederico Moraes sought to legitimize geometric abstraction not as an imported formalism, but as an authentic unifying identity for Latin American art and for a construction of reality common to all Latin America. His framework treated the construction of national identity as inherently artistic. Moraes' interpretation of cultural production is a clear expression of the relational voice as it explicitly connects artistic practice at the individual level with the formation of a collective identity. Next slide, please. It is harder to see in photographs, but Escritura Hurtado, as many of Soto's other works, breaks away from two-dimensional geometric abstraction by extending into the viewer space with kinetic elements. Kineticism, as the French art critic Jean Clay observed, is not about things that move. It is the awareness of the instability of the real. By denying the notion of a fixed truth, as many work do, Soto's work challenges the rational objectivity of liberal individualism and exemplifies how Latin American art undermines Western paradigms. Slide, please. Despite these innovations, 20th century Latin American art was seen as primitive and derivative of the West, as exemplified in these off-the-cuff comments by Clement Greenberg. And I use him here as a foil, not to villainize him, but because he epitomizes the detachment that is characteristic of liberal individualism and Western formalism. And I want to draw attention here to his use of the French word fauve, which denotes primitive beasts or wild beasts, and his rejection or dismissal of storytelling and myth when he says, when you're young and maybe you can't see art, you're interested in the story. Slide, please. The values that undergird Western narratives make the relational voice invisible. Slide, please. As Gilligan points out, becoming aware of the assumed universality of Western values enables us to raise questions about what we hold to be true, about the foundations of knowledge, or what is currently called the canon. Slide, please. Recognizing the inadequacy of Western narratives for the analysis of Latin American art, scholars like Peruvian Juan Acha called for the formulation of new theories from a Latin American perspective, which leads me to observe a kind of double blindness that has kept Latin American scholars from not only recognizing the relational nature of Latin American art, but also the relational nature of their own theories. Slide, please. Marta Trava's own trajectory stands out as an example of this double blindness, seeking first to educate Latin Americans on the best European art and theory, then centering Latin American art and artists in relation to international modernisms, to finally articulating her theory for an art of resistance, at each stage interpreting her context and centering what she understood to be in the best interests of the broader community. Slide, please. In Cajamarca, as in other of Cildo's work, there's an element of iteration, of series, each different, but under the same title. There's only one Cajamarca and Ama's collection that I'm aware of, but other versions exist. Slide, please. However, Alma's collection has 4 compositions titled Mar de Lurin, or Sea of Lurin. And there are many more series like Cajamarca and Mar de Lurin, Sol Negro or Black Sun, El Innombrable, slide please, and Los Visitantes, the visitors, to name a few. Slide please. Each painting is titled the same, Mar de Lurin. Slide please. Each offers a different perspective to Mar de Lurin. Rather than an objective truth, each is better understood as a new take on a poem or a book we keep coming back to, each time read anew. An old landscape revisited over a lifetime, or seeing a family member once every year during the holidays. Ceaseless iterations represent the same thing from multiple perspectives, like recognizing that there are multiple ways of being Peruvian, or Puerto Rican, or Latin American. Slide, please. Similarly, Estrellita Brodsky notes that Soto attacked the purported sanctity of a work of art, understood as a contemplative reflection of a single universality and the product of a unique perspective, and stressed instead the collaborative nature of a work of art in flux and constantly shifting. It can be interpreted as a form of, or the work can be interpreted as a form of authoritarian resistance and viewer empowerment. Slide, please. Soto's works involve the viewer in the act of creating meaning. And here we see one of his earlier works. It's not visible in this image, but there's actually 2 surfaces. If we saw it from the side, we would see a plexiglass floating a few inches in front of another board, which allows for the image to shift as viewers move around or move in relation to the artwork. Slide, please. This connection to social context was eschewed by Western artists. In the United States, abstraction regularly aspired to be what the Australian art critic Robert Hughes describes as socially indifferent. Similarly, writing about Jackson Pollock, the American artist Donald Judd famously stated, "The drip paint in most of Pollock's paintings is drip paint. It's that sensation and nothing modifies it." And Frank Stella was at pains to insist that what you see is what you see. Slide, please. The art historian, Alexander Alberro, identifies that Latin American artists sought to imagine art as an integral aspect of intellectual life that responded to their own particular concerns, leading them to focus on the relationships between the artwork, the viewer, and the site where the subject and object come together. Alberro refers to this web of relationships as the aesthetic field and defines it as an area of possibility through which the spectator constructs meaning. This definition effectively shifts the locus of the work from the object itself to the dialogue it creates with the observer. Slide, please. In works like this, the foreground and the background are determined by the perspective of the viewer, and meaning is created through engagement. Slide, please. Soto's work eventually left the wall and became immersive installations, as in his Penetrables, here seeing Houston Penetrable. Slide, please. Which also function as a callback to the Brazilian Helioticica and his Penetrables, and by association to anthropophagy and its early 20th century origins in indigenism. Slide, please. In conclusion, the relational voice reveals an underlying ethical framework that guided how 20th century Latin American artists and scholars thought about art. It explains a fundamental way in which the Latin American art manifests. I offer the insights of my research as a response to Juan H's call for theories about Latin American art from Latin America, with the hope that it can provide or lead new pathways and greater freedom in the analysis and interpretation and presentation of Latin American art. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. I will now invite our session 2 panelists, to turn their cameras back on for some questions. I'll give our audience members a chance to either put your questions in the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand feature to notify us that you want to ask it directly.
Rosa, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
I have a question for Rachel. Thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. I wanted to ask you, because I know you're a curator, right? So I wanted to see how you're thinking about grappling with Maria Martin's use of these myths, right? You said yourself, she was instrumentalizing these myths, these indigenous myths from Brazil for her own strategies of positioning herself as a Brazilian artist abroad. So how both are you thinking about these complexities, but also what strategies you're thinking of using if you're, ever thinking of curating an exhibition, or if you are perhaps working an exhibition on these themes, how to visually kind of have the audiences also reflect upon these very complex issues of identity and appropriation and, identities in last century. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you so much for the question. I think that there was, many of you may be familiar, and an exhibition I'm deeply sad to have not seen, but in 2022 at the Museo de Arte in Sao Paulo, they did a big exhibition on Martins that precisely tried to tackle this kind of slippery nature of her, and it was called Tropical Fictions. And I think that is really a model of like, she particularly is such a like fascinating, multi-layered figure, and I highly recommend that catalog to anyone who has time to check it out. That sort of unpacks all of these different layers around her and sort of structured the whole exhibition around the fact that she is this. So from the sort of most top line didactic text, you're confronting that immediately, that she had all these different layers. And obviously, for anyone who's familiar with her, there are so many other layers to her that I didn't even get to, just hyper focusing on this Amazonia thing. But she was also, sort of a dealer and operator within the New York art scene. And so the exhibition tackles the sort of other aspects of her life, and then also had a very fascinating return to Brazil, where she was sort of both deeply involved in some of the creation of art institutions in Brazil in the 50s, but also sort of out of step with geometric abstraction. But yeah, to answer your question on a more practical level, I think like how we illuminate the complex layers of artwork in a museum setting is sort of the eternal question of the job. Certainly like there's a way in which the way we write museum text has come forward in many ways to be more apace with what scholarship is doing and trying to translate the ideas in a really clear way that audiences could understand. But beyond that, I think it comes down to why I brought up the Massby exhibition, is kind of how we frame the show in general, and that can do a lot for folks to then maybe see the artwork in a different light or approach it with more curiosity and sort of try to get at these deeper layers that might not be evident in the physical sort of appearance of the artwork itself. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. We have a question from the audience. Michelle Mana in DC asks or says, "Thank you for this most interesting presentation by all the panelists. In your research and scholarship, how important was the role of the embassies of the various countries that these artists were from, lived in, exhibited in, and where their collectors lived?" So a general question to all three.
I can speak briefly about that. It's not necessarily where most of my research is concentrated or focused on, but I would have to say that it had a huge impact in some of these women artists to be able to participate and take their works abroad. So if the Argentine Foreign Office would help with the shipping, it sounds kind of silly, right? But they can be really costly for artists from Argentina, especially to send their works abroad. So having that support, really does have a huge impact in the possibilities of, expanding the visibility abroad, and that also has an impact at home. Yes, yes, shipping is a really important factor indeed. So thank you, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. And next, Adriana would like to expand on that question as well.
Thank you very much, Rosa, and all the panelists. And again, it's really amazing to see all our pieces on the on the light of the studies that you are doing. And Rachel, it is really awesome to see research on that particular piece. And actually, I want to tell you an anecdote before I go to expanding on the question. When we were installing the exhibition, I was telling Rosa and Katie how we had this massive sculpture that was very difficult to move because it was really heavy. And then each time that we wanted to move the piece, everyone was like, no, that piece, we don't want to move the piece. But it is a fantastic piece. And when I said at the beginning of my presentation this morning that the Rockefellers donated several pieces to the collection, I was referring to that piece and the Torres Garcia. I just wanted to add that. And regarding to the question about the embassies and what Ayelen was saying, this is really important. And actually collaborating with embassies is at the core of the work that we do here at UAS. And we have the possibility to work with the bilateral embassy. When we talk about a bilateral embassy, is the ambassador that represents the country to the United States, but also at the UAS we have what we call a multilateral embassy, that it's an ambassador that represents a multilateral mission, that represents the country here at the UAS, and it deals with all the different ambassadors. So as Ayelen was saying, it is not only the it is the cost of the shipping, the sponsoring the visas, but also it is really important because some of these offices, the embassies, are the ones that come to us with projects in the case of the museum. So, for example, to give you we had a major exhibition of Enrique Tavara, and everything from Ecuador, and everything was done through the embassy and the mission. So they are amazing collaborators, and not only here at the UAS, but in other institutions. So I just wanted to emphasize that for us, for our museum, that collaboration is pivotal to the work that we do. Without these embassies, we couldn't do what and have the exhibitions that we have.
And Carlos, would you like to expand on Ashlin's initial question about Martins?
Yeah, and I'd like to preface by saying that I have not studied Maria Martins, so I defer to Rachel on some of these ideas. But more broadly speaking, it seems to me from my research that Latin American artists in general can be seen having the same kind of conflict as Maria Martins. Many of them from elite classes and discovered their Latin Americanness while traveling abroad. So I feel like a lot of their production comes from a complex overlapping of issues that have to be with being abroad and discovering their Latin Americanness, from being pigeonholed as representing primitive at that time in the early 20th century primitive representations or indigenism, etc. And then discovering their own interests in the culture and so forth, tied to interests in elevating those cultures and all of that. So very complex, different kind of issues. Cildo is one of the exceptions, I think, where he discovered his interest in Latin America and pre-Columbian cultures before traveling abroad, but was still reinforced in that process. Tarsila do Amaral comes to mind as another Brazilian that had that kind of conflict in the work that she was doing.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Marco.
Yes, my question is for Ashlyn. I really love those two photos of Sarah Grillo, and I'm really interested on knowing how Latin American artists pose on photos or like position themselves like physically in front of their paintings or in these collectives as the Grupo de los Cinco, where she was posing among men. So I would like to know how, if there's like some recollections or some kind of other photo sessions, or what was Grillo's experience of like presenting herself as a modern artist with this kind of in this kind of methods, or how she was looking at herself inserted in the New York scene, especially also with her collaborations with Fernandez Muro, or this comment that you just mentioned that she was working among all these other men artists.
Thank you, Marco Polo. It really is an obsession of mine to look into his photographs, especially because most of my research delves into either queer or women artists from this period in Argentina. Looking at photographs has been really great source of information about how they are both presenting themselves and how, what are the images that were circulating and that they were making available. Lily Prati is an example that comes to mind. She's also an artist that was part of the Arturo magazine in 1944, Gamas, ese grupo de artistas modernos Argentina, de ASI, de Asociación Arte Concreto Invención. And I don't know, there seems to be something about the group themselves realizing that there's just one woman that seems to be the girlfriend or the wife of another artist part of the group. So they always seem to be placed right in the middle or in a very central point in the photographic composition that really contradicts the actual kind of visibility that these women artists had within the groups and the spaces that they were able to negotiate within them. Which is really curious because they all seem to have just kind of very central. And I'm also thinking of an artist like Silvia Torres, who was part of the exhibition Arte Destructivo in 1961. There was also all men, and she was at the time dating Kenneth Campbell. So it is curious. It's very contradicting, and I think it goes to show how they are kind of negotiating the possibilities that they had within those modern art spaces. Yeah, it's a very, very great source of information, some of those images, and there's definitely a lot more than that we as our historians can do with them. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm really happy to keep on talking about this topic after the symposium as well.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, go ahead, Carlos.
I have a question about language or referencing language. One of the things that I'm wrestling with is translating or talking about the concept of the relational voice in Spanish. I don't feel like I have a good way of translating that other than saying voice or voz. But relational is not the same as relación. So I wondered if anyone has any ideas of potential terms to use for translating the concept of relational voice. And we can follow up later if there aren't any immediate ideas.
I actually had a question back to you, Carlos, about that very question that you just asked. I myself am not a Spanish speaker, but when I hear relational voice, it sounds very like one direction or like linear to me. And I know what you spoke about is more of uh, like a plurality of care and gathering and ethics around that. So I was wondering in your research on on modern and contemporary art where an art piece is kind of seen sometimes as like a narcissistic statement on a singular artist, how you connect independent or like individual pieces to these larger um, group gatherings such as the Glenstone example that you gave.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I would say that it's not always visible in the work itself, right? So the relational voice underlines how work is created, what leads to the work, or how the work is framed, etc. So sometimes I would look to that in order to identify, which is why I thought it was so interesting to work with Cildo, but in particular Soto, because when you look at Soto, it doesn't appear relational at all, right? It comes from concrete art in the style of Claes Ondersberg and Max Bill and moves into this kineticism and optical space within geometry, which at first glance is not going to inspire this idea of relationship, especially in how at least how I have grown in academia, hearing about these subjects, right? But when you look at what they were trying to do and the broader connection, Federico Moraes and all these theorists and how they talk about the work, it starts to show up. So it shows up as an underlying framework or characteristic, if you will. That's how I'm looking at it. Does that answer your question? Is that what you were getting at, or was there
Yes,
something?
that's very helpful. In kind of visualizing the directionality of that.
I would say that works in indigenism, Mexican muralism, and even anthropophagy, which is othering the empire, right? Those are much more relational, evidently relational in how they look or how they present themselves.
Any other questions from the audience? I think we have time for one or two more. Okay, if not, I do have one final question. I was thinking back to Ashlin's and Rachel's presentations and just thinking about how sometimes these identities get put on, femme presenting bodies as as their like definitions, right? Like nationalities, like gender. Um, and both examples that you gave of Sarah Grillo and Martine how the both artists seemed very aware of these labels that were getting put on them, and I wanted to ask if both of you in your research had encountered moments where these female artists were kind of either subverting or like using those conflated identities like to their benefit, whether it's in marketing their work or in actually creating the pieces. Yeah, in subverting those labels. I don't know if that question made sense, but
No, definitely. I mean, I'm happy to start a little bit. I mean, certainly, I think like that's also what makes Maria Martins like so interesting. And she was certainly operating, the biggest sort of period of her kind of artistic success in the US was during the 1940s, so an even earlier moment than is described in Ayelen's talk, sort of where women's roles in society are more broadly changing. So I think there's definitely like a way of looking back at her as utilizing. I think that was why sort of her work seems such a interesting thing to talk about in the context of this symposium, because I think she definitely is sort of using her connections and her standing as a diplomat's wife to then kind of for her further her artistic career, or they're very intertwined, because I think maybe as Carlos pointed out too, but and other speakers have pointed out, for her as like a woman artist, a lot of her ability to sort of rise above and gain like public attention was due to her stature as like sort of part of this kind of more elite society, her wealth certainly to fund. But then at the same time, as you kind of see in the news media from the period, she was nonetheless sort of like boxed in and othered. And so I think her kind of awareness of that, we can definitely speculate at that, and it is very fascinating. I also think another interesting thing to think about with her that maybe also came up with some of these women in the circles in Argentina, like her sort of artistic career kind of came about later in her life, and that which is why I pointed out where her first kind of major solo exhibition in the US was in her 40s. And part of that is due to the fact that she was traveling around for her husband and didn't have the opportunity. And I think in women artists, especially in our scholarship and treatment of them, a lot of times that kind of timeline comes into play, and can be sort of disregarded or cast aside if their professional life doesn't start until later in life. And certainly, like when she returned to Brazil, a lot of the negative criticism around her was sort of like that she was just a diplomat's wife and like kind of parachuted into being an artist, like after her kids were older. And, it's all kind of very intertwined. I don't think any of this like answered your question, but maybe provided some helpful context. And I would be so curious to hear like Aylen's thoughts, in this Argentine context that she illuminated for us in her talk.
Yes, thank you, Rosa, for the question, and Rachel for thinking about this in the Brazilian context. I think there's something interesting about looking at these women from the 20th century, because we, from a contemporary lens, are, really interested in, subverting identities or radical demonstrations of ideas. And it seems to me that a lot of these artists are, really trying to tweak a comma in a sentence that is patriarchy, right? They're trying to see how they can play um, the game in a way that they can actually make art and be visible and have professional careers. Um, and it's sometimes, tricky for us from this contemporary point, because we would expect them to do more or to say something different, to have a different discourse than the one that they actually had. But there's something about this kind of very nuanced, kind of strategical ways of negotiating their identities as perhaps wives and mothers. Um, or perhaps in the case of Maria Martins, her privilege as being a diplomat's wife. Um, that's the positions that they were in. And so they were, trying to exploit that as much as they could to kind of find themselves a spot in kind of the modern art scenes. And I think that's, we can have our own ideas about how that was, but I think from a historical perspective, there's so many times that we find agency in just very small moments and small actions, regardless of the starting point of these women and these artists. And I'm even thinking of other artists, perhaps like that I quickly mentioned, like Josefina Rovirosa, who's also an artist that emerges in the 50s and had a really long and successful career within the Argentine context. She was also from a very wealthy family, and she was very widespreadly collected, mostly in Argentina. And she made abstraction. And something similar happened with Marta Pelufo, and that is that at some point they had divorces, and that really seemed to have tainted kind of their public image as women. And obviously today that wouldn't happen, but it was such a different context that sometimes we have to kind of pull back and kind of reimagine how that world must have been that for some of these women. Yeah, it's all more complex. I think we have to have, open eyes to see how some of that subverting actually could have happened. Yeah. Thank you, Rosa.
Of course, thank you. And Carlos, I'll let you make one last question or comment and before we head to lunch.
Very briefly, I wanted to suggest Diana Sieve Greenwald's book, Painting by Numbers. This book is focused on, I think, 19th century United States and European artists. So I'd love to see studies that stretch this or that parallel this in Latin America. But this book explores the kind of questions that you're talking about from a data-driven art history perspective. And it's fascinating to see how, you're discussing how her responsibilities and commitments affected the art that she made and how she made art. This book is looking at that kind of situation in terms of women's production, as well as the interaction between what women's participation is, what they produce, and what museums actually collect, right? And the discrepancy between that production and that collection process. So I thought that might be interesting for those of you who are interested in that subject.
It's a very good point. There's, the art that we see and then the art that we never see because it's in someone's basement in a collection. So thank you, Ayelen, Rachel, and Carlos for your presentations. That was a wonderful session to have and a lot of food for thought as we head into lunch. So we'll take a 30-minute break and reconvene for our final third session at 1 o'clock. And so we'll see you then. Thank you, everyone. We'll give a minute or two to let people trickle in. Okay, I think we can get started. Okay, welcome everyone. Hope you enjoyed your short lunch. Welcome to session 3, Institutions, Exhibitions, and Cultural Diplomacy. Once again, I will introduce our 3 speakers. Sol Izquierdo, Ana Maria Garzon-Mantia and Abigail Lapin Dardashti, who will present in succession. And I'd like to remind our audience members to hold their questions until the end of the last presentation, when we'll open the floor for our final Q&A. And I encourage people to participate, and if there are any questions that relate to the other two sessions as well, we can have one big Q&A session. Our first speaker, Sol Izquierdo de la Viña, is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Global Postdoctoral Fellow at the Spanish National Research Council and at New York University. Her research focuses on processes of mobility, such as travel, tourism, and exile, and the circulation and reception of images and material culture. Her current project, Transcultural Weaving, Exiled Jewish Women Artists of the 20th Century Americas, examines how European female artists in exile engage with indigenous textile techniques and motifs in Latin America from an intersectional gender perspective. She holds a PhD in art history from Universidad Complutense de Madrid and an MA from Freie Universität Berlin. Her doctoral research provided a post-colonial analysis of the reception of Indian art in the work of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, which led her to co-curate Whose Expression, the Burg Artists and Colonialism at the Burg Museum in Berlin. Ana Maria Garzon-Mantia will be our second speaker. She is an art historian and professor at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito and a PhD candidate in art history and theory at the University of Essex. She directs the academic journal Posts and co-directs Arte Activismos, a critical pedagogy lab. In 2023, she co-edited Estado Fósil, a multimedia project that studies 50 years of oil extraction in the Ecuadorian Amazonia. She is also part of a research group, Descentrar el Canon, and in 2023, she was the Jane Farver Curatorial Fellow at International Studio and Curatorial Program in New York, and the Helena Rubinstein Critical Studies Fellow at the Whitney Museum's Independent Studies Program. Garzon has received research grants from the Getty Foundation, CIMAM, and LASA, and is an alumna of Independent Curators International. Our final speaker of our last session will be Abigail Lapin Dardashti, who is an assistant professor of art history and visual studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her research examines modern and contemporary Latin American, Latin OAX, and African diasporic art with a focus on international exchange, migration, racial formation, and activism. Her work has received funding from the Social Science Research Council, the Fulbright Program, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, among others. She has curated exhibitions about Dominican American and Haitian American art at the BRIC, Brooklyn, and Teller Puerto Riqueño in Philadelphia, and has served as curatorial fellow at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Her work has been published widely in peer-reviewed journals, exhibition catalogs, and edited volumes in Brazil, the Dominican Republic, France, and the US. She is currently developing a digital humanities project about diasporic migration and modern art in Brazil. And last but not least, we'll bring Abigail to present the final.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to INA and the museum for organizing this wonderful symposium. Thank you so much to Rosa for all the coordination. This presentation is a very short excerpt of a chapter in my book, which is under review, which treats Afro-Brazilian art and international exchange during the period of Brazil's military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. So the chapter is about Brazil's participation in FESTAC. How do we recover the imagery of a visual arts exhibition that is only present in archives, collections, and newspapers through writing and not images? What are the contributions of the written archive to our visual understanding of geopolitical artistic circulations and exchanges? Next one, please. In this paper, I try to tackle these questions by looking at the Brazilian participation in the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture in Lagos, which I'll call FESTAC moving forward, which took place in January and February 1977. With 75 participating nations, FESTAC united over 15,000 people of African descent, as well as cultural producers and scholars working with the African diaspora from around the world for performances, exhibitions, and academic presentations. During a repressive military regime in Nigeria, only those with rarely granted photography permits could document the momentous exhibition of Afro-Brazilian art that spanned the colonial period to the present. In part because of this rule, there exists no available images of the installation in Lagos, and there is no accessible dedicated archive to study Brazil's participation. Next one, please. How do we understand the crucial impact of a large-scale exhibition with no installation photographs that articulate the Brazilian government's definitions of Afro-Brazilian art and identity? In this paper, I reconstruct the visual aspects of the exhibition using documentation collected in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, Salvador da Bahia, Lagos, Dakar, Paris, London, Washington, D.C., and New York. FESTAC took place after an important increase in Brazil's cultural diplomacy and economic exchanges in liberated Africa. Since the early 1960s, Brazil had engaged diplomatically with newly independent African countries to increase economic opportunities and cultural exchange. Next one, please. After the military coup in 1964, Itamaraty organized Itamaraty is the Brazilian State Department, who organized Brazil's participation in the First World Festival of Negro Arts in 1966, a more humble participation than at FESTAC. The medical doctor and art critic Clarivaldo Prado Valadares, who you could see here in this image over here, standing next to the sculpture, and you see him here behind. And in these images from the first festival, which is another chapter of my book, you see the art, like Rubem Valentim is the artist who's an abstract painter of the paintings in the background. Heitor dos Prazeres is here, and Clarival is here, and the other members are diplomats, Brazilian diplomats. And in this image, you see Léopold Sédar Senghor, who is the president of Senegal, Rubem Valentim, who's standing next to him, who's a little bit hidden, Clarival in the background. And this is a Senegalese artist who helped organize the contemporary exhibition with the participating nations. So Clarival curated the Brazilian section in the First World Festival of Negro Arts Contemporary Art Exhibition, including Heitor dos Prazeres, Rubem Valentim, and the late Aguinaldo Manuel dos Santos, whose sculpture we see here. Itamaraty leveraged the exhibition to argue for the existence of racial harmony and the lack of racism in Brazil, demonstrating, which we know is completely untrue, demonstrating that the artists' practices and their art attested to these alleged realities. This perspective aligned with Cold War interests to suppress communism by delegitimizing liberation movements in Africa and supporting Portuguese colonization in Mozambique and Angola. Next one, please. However, during Brazil's economic boom in the 1970s, Itamaraty, so the State Department, shifted its position to support groups fighting Portuguese colonies in Africa, aligning themselves with independent African nations rather than European and North American ones in an effort to secure oil and advertise Brazilian products on the continent. They evidenced their commitment with Minister of Foreign Affairs Mario Gibson Barbosa's unprecedented trip to 9 African countries. As opposed to the Dakar Festival, FESTAC encouraged the participation of liberation movements and North African nations, broadening the political makeup as well as the definition of the African diaspora at the event. Next slide, please. Brazil's participation exceeded those of neighboring nations and rivaled only European nations like France and England with many more resources. Itamaraty planned a large-scale exhibition of Afro-Brazilian art for Festac that included 3 galleries and was curated also by Valadares. They chose the Black psychiatrist Jorge Alaquija to head the Brazilian delegation and coordinate the South American participation at the festival. Through their exhibition at Festac, the state articulated a historical vision of Afro-Brazilian art and artists for the first time, positioning them within Brazil's artistic narrative from the colonial period to the present. However, they aimed to demonstrate that Black Brazilians had been integrated into Brazilian society since the colonial period, overlooking centuries of oppression, slavery, racial injustice, and discrimination that still permeated the country. Additionally, Brazil's participation and their selection of Alaquija, whose name was Yoruba, emphasized the stress on Afro-Brazilian origins from Yoruba, a people residing in Nigeria, Benin, and parts of Togo, overlooking the roots in Brazil of Angola and Congo people. Valadares originally planned the exhibition layout to fit into a 3-story pavilion that Itamaraty had built in Lagos with prefabricated material used for a building in an African industrial exhibition where they had presented Brazilian goods. So they kept the building, they stored the building that they used for this commercial exhibition in Lagos and then rebuilt it for the festival and for the exhibition. While the choice to use the same building certainly saved the government time and money, since it sat as storage in Lagos, it also demonstrates the economic interest deployed in their commitment to a large Brazilian participation at Festac. Documents evidence that a smaller version of the pavilion was built in an island off the coast of mainland Lagos because of lack of funds due to the festival's delay from 1975 to 1977. Next one, please. The curator identified, so Valadares identified most of the artists in his exhibition as being of African descent, regardless of their self-identification. Almost a decade before, the Dakar Festival required that all participants be of African descent, a rule inconsistent with Brazil's rhetoric of racial democracy and one that caused tensions between Brazilian and Senegalese diplomats. However, Festac did not have rules about participants' identities. This position benefited Brazil, as Itamaraty's diplomats could argue that all Brazilian artists, regardless of appearance and identity, had African heritage through the imagined and mythical process of racial democracy. Although Valadares showcased artwork by Black artists, as well as by white artists who evoked Afro-Brazilian figures and culture, he continued to deny the existence of an Afro-Brazilian art or an Afro-Brazilian artist. His retroactive identification of many intellectuals and artists from previous centuries as being of African descent furthered his argument that all Brazilians had African heritage. So relating to this myth of racial harmony in Brazil. He wrote, quote, "The predominance of the Black person declined in the face of the natural ascendancy of his mestizo descendants," end quote. So this is Valadares talking. Through the exhibition, Valadares articulated racial democracy's consequential integration of all people into Brazilian society, veiling the deep-seated inequalities and racism stitched into the country's fabric. Next one, please. At Festac, Abdias do Nascimento, who's an Afro-Brazilian intellectual you see in the center of this image here, and who at the time was a visiting professor in Nigeria and was a full tenured professor at the University of Buffalo. So Abdias infamously decried Brazilian racial discrimination and racial democracy through a paper at the colloquium at Festac and by distributing flyers to festival participants. His actions infuriated Itamaraty as they treated to undermine their investments and image in the festival. Next one, please. I'm happy to talk more about Abdias' role at the festival during the Q&A. While the dearth of archives committed to Brazil's FESTAC participation and the lack of documentation on it around the world limits the knowledge about the details of the exhibition, we can piece together different elements to understand how the visual makeup of the show had impacted Afro-Brazilian art history and exhibitions to this day. Retracing the installation of the exhibition, which I do in further detail in the chapter, not only articulates the importance of Afro-Brazilian art on a global stage during the dictatorship, but also points to the constant inequalities that appear in the archive and the narratives that are shaped through it. By pushing back on the traditional makeup of archives and repositories, we can unveil stories that shape new narratives about the circulation of Afro-Brazilian art and exhibitions in a complex geopolitical setting and period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail, and Sol and Ana Maria for your presentations. We can move on to our final Q&A session. I'll give everyone a moment to collect their thoughts and questions. If you would like to utilize the raising the hand feature or put your questions directly in the chat box, that'd be greatly appreciated. Okay, we'll start off with you, Abigail.
Thank you. Sol, I loved your paper. I'm so fascinated. I didn't even know Lena Schneider-Keiner changed her name when she was in Bolivia. I'm so happy that you're doing this research, honestly. And I was wondering if you thought that her experience as a Jewish person who escaped mass murder in Europe connects to the work that she did in Bolivia with the textiles, because she shifts from being a visual artist to being more of an organizer and working with textile. And so that's why I feel like her work before the war is a lot more explored, and it's also in a place that's more accessible.
Yeah, I will start. Thank you for your question, first of all. And in general, she is not very well known, and her work is kind of spread between different collections, and also part of her paintings she did in Berlin and during the trip, they are better known, but still many of them disappeared during the Nazi persecution and the Holocaust. And then she was shortly in Ibiza, and there she opened this hotel where she started, I think, with this kind of enterprises. So she had a different role. She had this way of combining her this other kind of more addressed to tourism and different things. So the other kind of work, so to say, she was trying to combine it with arts. So because in this hotel she was showing her paintings as well, and then she escaped to New York, and in New York she started with the textiles because she was producing textile books. And then she moved to Bolivia, as I already mentioned this story. And well, I don't know, I think her work with textiles has more to do with her experience during the trip in Asia, because there she started to have an interest on non-Western arts and textiles. And also in Berlin, she was working as a fashion designer. So so that on the one side is more work with textiles, but I think she developed also an interest on non-Western cultures. And of course, probably her work with these communities had to do with her experience of exile and kind of marginalization, or but it's a kind of an open question. I hope I was answering to it. Thank you.
Ana Maria?
Hi, I also have a question for Sol. I agree with Abigail. It's really interesting that you're doing this research. I found a little bit of information of Eleska, and it was super difficult to follow her trace. So it's really exciting to learn about her work. And I was wondering if in your work, have you found anything about the relationships she was having with indigenous communities in Bolivia? How they were the contracts, how were like the approaches that she was making, anything related mostly with the people she was working with there.
Yeah, there is like very scant documentation. So I found this documentation about the exhibition and then the booklet I was showing, which is like kind of promotional, promotional documentation, and nothing regarding contracts. But I know, like I'm in contact with her great daughter, and she was explaining me a bit more how this company worked, and she told me that it was a kind of cooperative. So they had this house in Cochabamba, which was like the main workshop, and then also the communities around in the towns around Cochabamba were making the textiles at home, and then sending, or and then from this central house were doing the exhibitions and commercializing it. But I don't know exactly how, like, the contracts and more in detail. I found one PhD on other I think this PhD is from the 80s, and there are some interviews to people that were working for Andea, and there, I was reading a bit more, but this is focused mostly on how USAID help was organizing different companies or textile and handicrafts companies in Bolivia. And I must say, even though I think she acknowledged this indigenous arts, I must say that there was also a kind of power relationship between her and the communities, of course. So I always see this tension in this project. But I don't know if you now. I want to ask you what did you find about her, because maybe it's like something different.
Not that much, actually, just the same brochure that you showed. And I'm traveling to Bolivia next month, so hopefully something more.
Thank you for the question.
Adriana?
Sorry, my computer is kind of slow. I just have a question for Sol as well. Thank you for your presentation. And I am wondering if there was at some point some contact or some sort of communication with Ines Córdoba from Bolivia.
Unfortunately, I don't know if.
Because I see Ines's practice is also with textile. It is more abstract, but I'm just wondering because there is a lot of similarities I see. So I was just wondering.
No, but thank you. So maybe I should search for that. But as I say, there is no the documentation is very scant, so I didn't find any, for example, letters, or not a lot. So but I will search for that connection. Thank you.
Yes, Carlos?
Thank you all for your presentations. Really interesting. So along the same lines, I was curious if you happened in your research to come across any connections between Andrea and Annie Albers, Joseph Albers' wife, who also worked with textiles. I think she was more influenced or engaged in Peru and Mexico, but just wondered if you see any evidence of her being engaged in Bolivia as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think Annie Albers had many similarities or had some things in common with, of course, Lene Schneider-Keiner, because both were escaped from Germany, more or less from in the same period. But actually, I don't know if they knew each other. And also, I think the work they producing were very different because Annie Albers was working then in the college. Now I forgot the name. But she was in the Bauhaus, and then okay, I know I forgot the name, but you all know this college in North Carolina. And she was producing this
Black Mountain
College, yeah. Sorry. And she was producing these big racks that are more paintings, so it's like a different work. And I think she started, or her interest started in Berlin when she was visiting the ethnographical collections there from Annie Albers. And then she went mostly to Mexico and to Peru, but I don't know if she was in Bolivia as well. Yeah, but there are connections with other women exiled in the US. There was another artist working in Chicago that she was in contact with, I think with Annie Albers, also with Lene. She was visiting Lene at some point, and she was also in Ecuador visiting Olga Fish. So I'm looking also at these kind of networks between these exiled women that were working with textiles. So yeah, thank you.
Any other questions from maybe the audience or other panelists? Yes, Katie.
Just a kind of broad question, because it struck me that all three of these papers really were thinking about and harnessing or digging into our archival research in really interesting ways. I really enjoy seeing the newspaper clippings, the exhibition pamphlets, and I just wonder if any of you want to reflect on the limitations of archival research and elements that you're still hoping to find or searching down in your research and where you go next.
I could start. Well, my entire paper was about not finding things that I think I need. But that's kind of the story of my book. And I hope one day someone will find installation photographs of the Brazilian exhibition at Festac. In the chapter, I reconstruct the exhibition through interviews with artists and different documents that I found. I was able to trace what got taken out of the final exhibition as well, because the exhibition changes from, I found a layout of the exhibition and it changed, which I didn't have a chance to show today, but it changes from that layout to the final show because Brazil ends up investing less money in it in the end. But I think, it's all the papers today, in a sense, document how important it is for us to pursue research projects that don't necessarily have obvious archives. And like Lena Schneider-Keiner is a great example, I think, also because I heard about her in a podcast, actually, from the Leo Beck Institute, which is a really good podcast. But yeah, I think searching, stitching together documents we find in untraditional places is the way forward in research.
I agree with Abigail. I think that in my case, I think that I'm making the archive at the same time as I'm doing the research. Maybe in the case of Enrique Tavara is the only Ecuadorian artist whose family has assembled a proper archive and is strong and they have a lot of information. But in the case of Maldonado or other artists, it's super difficult to find like a complete body of documents to assemble the histories. So part of the research I conducted at the Museum of the Americas was really important because they were receiving clippings and catalogs during the 50s, during the 60s, and it's much more complete than the things that I was able to find here in Ecuador. Here I have to conduct research simultaneously at different like national archives and looking in newspapers like page by page and page, trying to find just a little clipping, just a little piece of information. So that leads me to think that the lack of primary sources to conduct certain kind of art or of art historical research is really both an impediment to get deeper into certain subjects, but also is a kind of blessing because you get the chance to speculate, to find different narratives, and to like somehow collaborate in the construction of a body of work that can be used by other scholars. But I think that work is really lonely and really difficult because it's not easy to have people to talk about what you're doing or sources, especially in the cases in which families of the artists are not interested in holding anything related with their grandparents or their parents. Yeah, but at the same time, I find it really exciting. It's like being a detective, like the Nancy Drew of the archives, trying to assemble little pieces of histories.
I love what you said about being a Nancy Drew of archives. I think that really covers what all three of you are doing. It seems like Adriana has another question.
More than a question is a comment, of course. We are very proud to see that the holdings that we have here in our archives are part of pretty much all you guys in everything in the work that you are doing. And the comment that I wanna make two comments. One is the fact that the OAS began collecting archival material before the actual art collection. So the very first purpose of the Department of Intellectual Cooperation at the OAS in 1917 was to start collecting newspapers clippings of everything that was happening in the Americas. That was like the main purpose. So our archives predate Jose Gomez Sicre and the work that he did with the collection. So the body of documents that we have here is very strong. But also I wanna talk about an initiative that is pretty new. That it's called in Spanish, it's called ALMA, that is Asociación de Legados de Artistas. It's an association of artist legacies from the Americas. And one of the curators that is working with them is in our audience today. And part of the work that they are doing is to try to get together with all the different artist estates. And if they are not organized, trying to help them get organized. So they preserve, they take care of their collections, and they are able to have that and make it accessible for for scholars. And actually, the Tawara Foundation is actually an example of that. And the Tawara Foundation is like at the lead of this organization. So that's something that I think that for you all scholars is very important to know, that this is happening, that it's happening as we speak. We are organizing an exhibition with them later in the year to celebrate our 50th anniversary. But there is an aim to cultivate the little or big information that states have. So this information is available for research.
Hey, are there any questions to the larger symposium in general before we head to our closing remarks? Doesn't look like we have any other questions. All right, then I will turn it over to, well, actually, before I turn it over, I just want to say thank you to each one of our presenters, starting from 9 a.m. this morning until now. Thank you so much for sticking with us, and thank you for those audience members who were, whether you came in for one talk or you stayed with us the whole day. We truly appreciate your attendance at this symposium. And with that said, now I will turn it over to Katie.
Thank you so much, Rosa. I want to just echo what Rosa said. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Modern Movements Symposium. I learned so much, and I thought that this was a really fruitful discussion and sharing of new research. I invite you all, again, if you're in Washington, D.C., to come visit our exhibition at Hillier Gallery, International Arts and Artists Space, which is right in DuPont Circle. Of course, I also invite you to visit the Art Museum of the Americas, which is right downtown. Again, we will be traveling a larger version of this exhibition, 59 artworks in total, all around the country. So if this is something that you'd like to see brought to your community, please reach out to us. We would love to work with you to make this traveling exhibition a success and to really share more about what AMA and OAS are doing and the importance of Latin American and Caribbean art. I also encourage you, Rosa, do you want to go back for 1 second to check out our Bloomberg Connects page? And Rosa had put a little Scantron that will lead you directly there. It will guide you kind of through the Hillier exhibition, but also share lots of wonderful information about the exhibition, including awesome audio from Adriana herself about the different works of art. So please, if you'd like to learn more, take a moment to check that out. And thank you so much to our panelists. This really was a wonderful event. Adriana, do you want to say any last words before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank you, Katie, thank International Arts and Artists, all of you for joining us today. Again, invite you to research here. Our archives are here for you. If you cannot travel, we are always happy to scan documents. And we just want you guys to think about our holdings, the collection, and the role that this institution has had for your practices. It's really important that you see that we are an ally and we are here to see all your research come to fruition and to help you in anything that you need. So please reach us. We are always here to help, and please visit the Bloomberg Connect. The exhibition is a really good selection of pieces of our collection, and thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, everyone.